Hello, everybody. My name is Thomas Frackin, and this is the Roundtable Chats podcast, a platform where ideas are challenged and the life stories of extraordinary people from around the globe are explored, one conversation at a time. Today, my guest is Zeke Sky. Zeke is a gifted musician whose album Animals of God and War was released this year on iTunes and Spotify, which has been listened to by people all over the world. I was blown away by his song of Gods and War, which I'll play shortly, and highly recommend giving his music a listen. Zeke, like myself, is an orthogonal thinker with a deep background in philosophy, which made for a truly insightful and refreshing conversation on many important topics. This is quite a long episode, but it was necessary because if you carefully meditate on the ideas we explore in depth, the way you see the world may expand in surprising directions. Quick disclaimer, if you're in favor of deplatforming controversial speakers or think free speech should have certain restrictions, you might have a negative emotional reaction to the first hour of our conversation. So I just wanted to give you a heads up. For my listeners, however, who are interested in hearing a truly novel perspective and a new take on Trump, totalitarianism, postmodernism, and the potential differences between men and women, this is the conversation for you. And now, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, here is Zeke Sky. Zeke, welcome to the round table. How are you today?
I'm great, Thomas. Good to be with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And just to begin, before we dive in, I just wanted to thank you personally for taking kind of control and being a moderator on the Roundtable Chats Facebook page and adding your fans. And it's really grown my podcast since then. For my listeners, if you heard episode 12 with Yoho, the Finnish scientist/engineer, I would not have even met this guy if it wasn't for Zeke adding his fans, because he was a mutual friend of me and Zeke. So I just wanted to thank you personally for doing that.
You're welcome. I'm happy to contribute to the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So to begin, how I always start these interviews is, what are you grateful for?
So I guess there are lots of material things I could point to, like family and friends and stuff like that. But really, when I think about all that stuff, I think what I'm most grateful for is just the opportunity to have all those things, just being born into the world and being given a family and being given, the chance to be involved with music, to be involved, with teaching music, with playing music. and maybe just to be like more specific, the specific conditions that I, kind of came into, which was, living in America in a time that is very peaceful and prosperous, and just the continued effort that I see on the part of people all over the planet, that I see on Facebook, YouTube, all over the place, to better themselves.
Yeah.
Themselves. It's a very inspiring time to live in.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up, because that's also something I'm very grateful for, and something that I think people our age or in our generation. Are you a millennial? Like, when were you born?
So I was born in 1990.
Okay, yeah. So I think you technically fit into the millennial generation, I think. I don't know where the cutoff is. Close, yeah. But regardless, people who are born in first world countries in the 21st century, like living in the 21st century, it's the amount of opportunity, the ability to collaborate has never been easier. If you're listening to this now, I can safely assume that you either have a laptop or an iPhone. And what you can do with that technology, essentially, is just nothing short of miraculous. I mean, just a quick example, I'm close to a 1-year anniversary of a girl I'm close friends with, who I met through Tinder making a mistake. The algorithm made a mistake. I was in DC, she was in DC, but then I moved back home to Boulder. And when I was using Tinder for Boulder, I was still matching with girls from DC. And because of that mistake, me and her met. She's from the Philippines. She's living in the Philippines right now. She's going to move to Europe to do a master's. She keeps telling me to wait for her. But we've been talking on Facebook for the longest of time, right? Like a year now. Probably the longest friendship of that sort I've had. And that would not have been possible if I was living in any other century. So, I'm totally with you there.
Yeah. I think it's interesting also because the way that technology has changed our life is, I just got to say, it's directly proportional to the infrastructural changes that have happened since the Enlightenment.
Wow. Before
the Enlightenment, stuff that was even going on before then. But one of the important things to remember is, even in the absence of technology like Facebook and stuff like that, it's important to know that this is the last stream of things that have happened in the last 20 years. But before that, we had invented airplanes.
Right.
It's easy to overlook. World travel became possible, not that long ago, but way before the internet.
Yeah.
So humanity has been intermingling in a way that is not necessarily it's a positive thing. It's a totally a positive thing. But we're still getting used to, we're still getting our footing for the specific environment of this kind of interconnectivity.
Right.
Which is, it's very easy to see that there's, I wouldn't even call it a silver lining, because there's really I don't see a negative part of it. But you do see that it takes a toll on some people.
Yes.
Some people can't use Facebook.
Right.
Some people can't deal with the interconnectivity and the ability to be able to, contact anyone in their life all the time, because I have a number of reasons I think that, but
No, great point. I think there is a dark side, but the dark side isn't the technology itself. It's just our failure to adapt to it, or some humans' failure to adjust. So, and that would just take time. But for instance, there's this really illuminating Harvard medical study that showed there's a direct correlation, not causation, but correlation between how long you spend on Facebook and how depressed you feel. And it was very thought-provoking, because it's like, well, is it that you're spending so much time on Facebook and you're comparing yourself to others, then you feel shitty and that makes you feel worse and ruminate? Or is it somebody who's already clinically depressed, it gravitates towards looking at Facebook and ruminating, and it rewards that? So it's unclear the causality, but it's still interesting. And I can actually speak from personal experience on this. I have type 1 bipolar disorder. So essentially half the time I have mania, where I get all these creative ideas and I'm super productive and I want to talk to everyone and I'm everyone's best friend and I just love humanity. And then the other half, I'm like severely depressed, totally withdrawn, stay in bed all day, hate humanity. And what do? I look at Facebook and just mindlessly scroll. And I know that I'm doing this, and I know I'm doing this because I'm depressed, but I still do it anyways. So I'm really fascinated by that research. It's really interesting.
It seems like it's a bit of a tick for you.
Yeah.
It's like an involuntary twitching type mechanism, which I've felt before. And I feel like I feel this kind of exact same. I don't even know how to explain it. I guess maybe sometimes being in malls, although it's harder to get to a mall. Like, you have to really decide you're going to a mall to be in a mall.
Yes.
All I have to do to find out who my high school girlfriend married.
Oh God.
In,
so easy.
in Mexico and some beautiful. All I have to do is open my phone.
Ugh,
but
it's too easy. Yeah.
I feel that kind of in malls. And have you ever had like road rage?
Personally, a little bit, but I know it's very common. Yeah.
Road rage is like, even legally, we kind of take it as this thing of, okay, your mind is just not in its normal place right now. We have other things like you can kill someone who's sleeping with your wife and you're going to get manslaughter. But I mean, it's when you see these people getting into these wars on Twitter and Facebook.
Yes.
You see, it's this very venal it's this very special case of aggression that would not probably occur in any other situation besides maybe road rage and the other one I mentioned.
Yeah. And the difference, I guess, is with road rage, I mean, they both have really heavy consequences, right? If you looked at the data. But what makes the social media example special is that you can plant seeds. I would say you could actually do more harm through these online battles psychologically, right, than the road rage. The road rage, you might, worst case scenario, kill someone, and that's horrible. But through online, you could like really have just shit on someone's heart. You could really have them question their entire identity. I mean, cyberbullying is a very severe problem, I think. And yeah, it's very easy to do.
So when you say cyberbullying, I'm very interested in actually what you just said. But,
yes, please.
I'm going to come at it from a couple of places. One of the things I'm going to say about that is that I think bullying is a very complicated thing. I think that, and I know that like this is like the pretext to like where every single person listening to this who maybe likes guitar playing kind of loses me a little bit. But I was bullied a lot as a kid,
same.
A lot. Yeah. I ended up in the hospital a couple of times.
No, I'm really sorry to hear that.
I feel that to the extent that it didn't kill me, it made me stronger.
Yeah, sure.
And I think that on Facebook we get this very special, almost biodome effect of it, which is where you get exposed to a lot of it really, really quickly, potentially, from people that you wouldn't otherwise interact with.
Yeah.
So, like, I have a public Facebook profile, for example. I don't know if you do, but I do.
Yeah,
so any random person who I've never known, don't have any reason, who just found my guitar playing or something, can just come and say some ridiculous thing to me.
Right.
And it is certainly a great exercise for me to be exposed. I mean, you have to be bombarded by this stuff. And I wonder how I would have turned out differently if I had just lived in the countryside my whole life and never had my beliefs tried.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, not being tested. Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah, and, I had the luxury to go to college and have lots of, I remember all kinds of times where I had some professors who made a point of me because I was always raising my hand and I always wanted to say something. You're the troublemaker
a little bit.
A couple of my professors, made a point of, this is kind of foolish, but I think that it's important that we expose ourselves to these things that we perceive as negative. And especially if I'm not a super experienced meditator. I think I've spoken about this before. I've been practicing meditation. But one thing that happens when you practice mindfulness and meditation is that you can slowly start to you can personify the negative thoughts that are already occurring in here. And when one comes in, maybe it's in the form of criticism or someone insults you or something like that. Mm-hmm. I think 10 years ago, maybe I looked at that kind of stuff as like an attack. Now my mind's eye smiles at those things.
Yeah. Oh yeah. You got some wisdom.
You're back here. Yeah. What's going on today, man?
Yeah.
Almost like some like unthreatening, any other unthreatening force that I would see. Some fat ugly dude hits on my girlfriend or something. I'm gonna be.
This is interesting. Yeah. What do you want? What are you trying to prove here? What's going on?
Yeah.
So you have this curiosity to you. Yeah. No. So on that, okay. There's a lot I can work with there or contribute, but something I've been practicing recently is when I'm on an online fight. It's not really that big of a fight, but a debate. Let's say that. We're on an online debate on some topic. So, for instance, there's one example that comes to mind very recently. Yeah, I was being a bit provocative, but it was more from an experimental perspective. I wasn't trying to hurt anybody or offend anybody, but I knew it would. I posted Majid Nawaz. I don't know if you know him, friends with...
I saw that.
Yeah.
I know Majid.
Yeah, so he made a post about International Men's Day. I don't even know this is a thing. I have no dog in this fight. I could care less whether it's an International Men's Day or not. And then he had a lot of statistics, and I just wanted to share it. And I had a hypothesis, and I kind of stated it when I published this post. And basically all I said was, I expect to get backlash from this. I don't know if I will, but I expect it. And I think even by saying that, I got less backlash, because if somebody read that, right, it's gonna change how they think a little bit. So it's almost like a psychological trick. But one of my friends, who I met through the philosophy club or whatever at University of Amsterdam, even though I don't study philosophy, I'm just fascinated. And he did a very, I think, thorough. I disagreed with him. We had a good, productive, actually, argument online in comment section, which is rare. But he did a very thorough, line by line, going through all the statistics and what he thought was misleading or hyperbolic or whatever. And I might totally fair. That was not the point of my sharing this post. It was not. He was not the target audience, but I'm glad he contributed because I learned some things. But then there's another friend of mine. And I won't call her out, but of course if you go on my Facebook, you'll see it. She's very intelligent. We're in the same development economics course. She wants to be a human rights lawyer. I'm sure she will be. I'm sure she'll be very successful and will be better off for it. That being said, in this example, she had a dog in the fight. She's very, I think, invested into the third wave feminism, progressive kind of ideology. And so she kind of saw that as an attack, what I posted, even though I didn't say anything about feminism or women even. Just the fact that this exists, an International Men's Day, she thinks is wrong. So she attacked me. I forget the specific thing she said, but it was just like...
I remember.
Yeah. What did she say?
She said that you weren't acknowledging the global patriarchy.
Yes. I love that word, patriarchy. Oh, it's a beautiful word. Beautiful idea. It's a great boogeyman. Yeah. I mean, look, just to clarify a little bit for our listeners, I mean, I'm not an expert on the patriarchy. What I will say is, sure, I think it has an influence, but I think you should be critical of anybody who only uses one framework to look at a problem. So if you just look through the framework of people are either oppressed or oppressors, or if you look at the framework that men have always been in control and there's this hierarchy and they've always dominated, it's like, yeah, there's truth to that, sure. But there's more to the story here. And to say, I think the most interesting thing she said that gave me something to think about was that, well, the reason that so many men are committing suicide and so forth is toxic masculinity and is the patriarchy. So they're told by other men that you need to bottle up your emotions, not show yourself. And like, I understand that. And I was personally influenced by that. I'm a very sensitive person. I cry very easily. I do not bottle up my emotions. Guys have given me shit for it. And that is toxic. Okay. But that to me is not a sufficient explanation for the entire problem. I think there's more to it than that. I think guys, many young men, and this is why I think Jordan Peterson, for instance, is so popular, feel isolated. They feel like nobody gives a shit about them. And to some extent, I don't think people do. And that can be debated, but I just... this is a messy problem. It's complex. I think that's what I said during the post a lot, is that this is a complex problem. This is not a good medium for it. I'd rather debate her on this podcast or one-on-one in real life. But it's messy. So I'm curious what your thoughts are, though, as an observer to this event.
I think that this is actually something I talk about a lot. I see it somewhat as a version of your seeing that truth must be examined between multiple lenses. Right. But I think it's actually bigger than that. Mm. It's just that truth is interdisciplinary by its nature.
Yes. Okay. Good.
So, very good. Yeah. So that if you take that in itself and you look at it on its face, actually that tells us something potentially disturbing about truth. That just might mean that most people don't have access to it, which is kind of a hard premise to really wrap your mind around, right? Because it makes it really hard to have the conversation.
Sure.
I mean, like if I'm speaking to a geologist, for example, and he has something to say about how the rock cycle, affects ecosystems in a specific way, I might know a thing or two about that, but I would, in most cases, kind of defer to his judgment. That's kind of like the most specific way I can think of having a direct conversation about something that is maybe super objective. But when it comes to stuff like, maybe the issues between men and women, you're invoking biology, you're invoking history, you're invoking... Right, there's so many. I can go on and on and on. Right. And these things themselves are even tainted with the lack of maybe interdisciplinary individuals that came to define those.
Right.
So I'm always very inclined to think that, there's not going to be, and that's part of the reason it's difficult to have a productive conversation on Facebook. Yeah. You're just getting everybody. You're getting everyone who's, had its X, Y, and Z experience and factors it in. Now, back to what you were saying about the actual content of that disagreement and Jordan Peterson and stuff like that.
All that, yeah.
I think that a guy like Jordan Peterson is having the, his day in the sun right now.
Yeah.
For kind of a different reason. I don't think it has anything to do with male loneliness specifically. I think it has to do with the way the opposition has framed the dichotomy between men and women. And one of the reasons this framing has caused such a backlash is because there are multiple viewpoints on, if we're going to talk about men and women, there are multiple viewpoints from the extreme side of kind of men need to be kind of subjugated because they've dominated history. There are lots of different definitions of that. Yes. I mean, you'll talk to people who are evolutionary biologists who will say that there are certain differences between the sexes that are non-extinguishable. You'll talk to people with maybe more of a perspective on anthropology who will tell you that there are certain cultures that have gotten past those things, and maybe there will be some agreement in those ways. What I think actually is the issue is that there's no significant message coming from the side of feminists that is wholly augmented towards a male viewership that will understand the needs and wants of women. Yeah. Right. And I think part of the reason for that is you can't really have a collective vision like that. Not all women think the same way. Not all women want the same things. Right. Yeah. So it would almost be bizarre for anyone to be speaking for a large population of women. Yes, I agree. That being said, we should acknowledge that in the last 100 years, extraordinary progress and change has happened. And it's important to pat ourselves on the back for the changes that have happened and for the fact that, we've gotten to a new place. But we also need to examine why we were in the place we were in before. Yes. It's not enough to just pat ourselves on the back and just kind of move forward and say, women have these things now, or even, African Americans, have these certain things now. Why were things like this before? What is the foundation and the framework that contributed to that? Right. Yeah. And I think that's something that a lot of people do not want to think about. Maybe it makes them very uncomfortable, Well, it's scary. Yes, it is. It's scary. At the most extreme, right? If you, I'm really going to go there. If you look at Hitler's appeal, this is something that I've studied a bit, and I actually want to read more deeply his writing. It makes people uncomfortable that I remember, if I say, Hitler was a great orator, some people can get very offended by that. But it's how else could he be so horrible? I have Jewish heritage. He was a great what? Oh, great orator, great speaker. Oh, yeah. I go even further than that. Yeah, sure. I'm just starting, but I'm just saying, even that itself, right? Some people get super offended and they're like, that's really disrespectful. I'm like, no, that's understanding the situation. And the problem isn't even that Hitler existed. I have a big issue when people say I'll go back in time and kill Hitler, or would you kill Hitler when he's a baby? I'm like, you're missing the point here. We shouldn't be afraid of someone like Hitler. We should be afraid that the masses would follow someone like Hitler, and that he was appealing to them somehow. It actually ties back to Trump. I'm not equating the two. I hate when people do that because it just downplays Hitler's impact. I think Hitler would be offended if he was compared to Trump. But with Trump, he's like, really? I actually worked hard. I actually wrote fucking books, I didn't have someone else write them for me. But with Trump, he actually read a book or two. Yeah, too. Right. Yeah. Hitler, Trump said that he's proud to not read books. It's great. That's just what I want in a leader. But the point is, I'm not going to just bash Trump this whole time. I'm saying, he is appealing to an emotion when he became president in 2016. And I'm afraid he will be reelected, for the record, in 2020. Oh, you haven't seen the news today then, have you? No, I haven't. What was the news today? I've been ignorant today. It's been boiling for a while, but Mueller seems to be circling a little bit more closely. Well, that's good. If in that case, that's good. I don't know. It needs to happen. Go back to what you were saying. Yeah, so it needs to happen because here's my concern.
I don't think anything's been learned by liberals, and I identify as a liberal myself. I don't think anything's been learned from the Liberal Party about how Trump got elected in 2016. I see a lot of kind of doubling down, putting your heels in, we're going to fight fire with fire. Like, I remember Michelle Obama had this great quote saying, when they go low, we'll go high. And I really resonated with that emotionally. But now I see all these progressives say, no, we're going to go low. And we tried going high and that didn't work. And I'm like, no, you did not. I have not seen any decorum given to Trump supporters. I haven't heard any class or kindness or compassion come from the left when Trump won. And they might say, well, Thomas, we lost. Why should we be compassionate? I'm like, yeah, that's your life. You don't have to be compassionate. But when you put yourself in the shoes, if you practice empathy with who voted for Trump in 2016, and if you look at certain case studies, for instance, when somebody voted for Barack Obama twice and then voted for Trump, that's really interesting. That's really bizarre. Or 53% of women voted for Trump. That's really interesting, So maybe part of that is just, right, you could say, the patriarchy and traditionalism, and they're just following what their husband said. Okay, but that doesn't explain all of them. We really need to listen to the voices of those who are not racist, they're not sexist, they're educated, they're intelligent, and they voted for Trump. Because obviously he said something that clicked, or Hillary said something that did not, and I don't know. But if you don't talk to them, if you deplatform people and silence people, how are we supposed to move forward? So that's my concern.
Well, so there's a lot there.
Yeah, it's a bit of a rant.
Well, let's start off with what we were saying about Hitler, and I think you actually bring up a good point, which is that there is a certain mechanism, and it's existed long before social media. This is a thing we feel very significantly as humans. When you even just say the word Hitler, it has a Voldemort presence to it.
It does.
I'm going to coin this right now. It's the Voldemort effect.
Yeah.
When the ability to have an objective discussion about that is immediately limited by the impact that Hitler had. It's immediately curtailed by. His name is just such a big force and thing in all of our minds at this point.
One of the
that
biggest,
it's almost impossible. It takes a little bit. It takes a bit of a meditation with yourself to really have just an objective conversation about the guy.
True.
And I think that there's actually a book called Hitler's Willing Executioners. I forget who wrote it, but
yeah, I've heard of that book. Yeah.
It unfortunately makes the point that you make, that Hitler was able to almost demonically move masses of people to kill other people.
Yeah.
And if you can, there are all of these pictures. I saw a set of pictures. It was I forget where I saw it. It was in some gallery from Reddit or something like that. And it was these nice pictures. It was these men. They were drinking water and just hanging out and having a nice time. Oh, I found it. I remember I found it because a guy, Sam Harris, was interviewing. These beautiful pictures of these guys enjoying a nice evening day, or just daytime. And it was revealed at the end of the pictures that these were people who were killing Jews in World War II. These looked like the very nice guys, And I think there is something about that is just so telling about the human condition, about the manipulatable nature of the human condition, and for people to really feel like maybe they're not doing the wrong thing when they really are. So the manipulation of the masses that way, to me, is just a phenomena that I don't have my head around completely, but I completely, I think it was very much in play here. And just a last point on Hitler, we should actually completely acknowledge the man's skills, because we will not be able to resist the next Hitler if we don't understand the characteristics of someone like Hitler.
Correct.
I think that one of the ways you see this is, could you have imagined anyone coming after Hitler? I mean, what if his dream of 1,000-year Reich was even partially realized? Can you imagine anyone coming after him for Germany in a real sense?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't even know who it would be. Maybe just like some admiral to go sign the peace treaty, but would have filled the void of a guy like him.
It's a great question.
The Third Reich was so completely ingrained in Hitler and his own vision that it's almost weird to call it the Third Reich or anything besides Hitler's party.
Right.
Now, as far as Trump goes and people who voted for Barack Obama and then Trump, I think there's a lot of things that are in play with Donald Trump getting elected. One thing that I wouldn't completely look past, though, is Barack Obama, and I hate to paint the American populace as racist. I don't like generalizing about race.
Yeah.
But don't you find it a little bit interesting that we elected our first black president ever for 2 consecutive terms?
Yeah.
He was very well loved by the public, and then a blonde, white...
the most white guy, most white privileged
so-called champion of industry comes along, and he gets elected.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I mean, there would have been other Republicans who could have fulfilled those criteria, but he was almost like the ultimate version of the if there was positive energy that went into voting for Trump, or went into voting for Obama, there was a negative energy created for someone like Trump. So imagine you dig a hole in the ground and you're trying to build a hill out of that hole, right? So you eventually get to the point where you piled up all this mud and it's just going 10 feet up. There's a 10-foot hole now in the ground.
Yeah.
That energy has been displaced, but it's not been destroyed. So that's kind of part of the way I see the Trump phenomena. Another thing that I think is that Trump is actually, I didn't vote for him, but Trump actually represents something very interesting about America. That someone could come to a position of power in a place like this, says that this place is filled very much to the brim with people who are living very kind of naive lives and not really able to see past the veil of materialism. And I think actually, even though I know that type of life isn't for me, I do think it says that there are a lot of people in this country who actually are very comfortable in their own skins. And they, just the fact that I'm going to say he's a parasite of sorts. Yeah. He's certainly some kind of parasite.
He's very manipulative.
If he's as bad as a lot of people will tell you he is, he's made a career out of this.
Yes.
How that could even be a thing that you could make a career out of and eventually become a president.
He's very unique.
Good about the environment here.
Yeah.
In a specific sense. In another sense, he's courted a ton of white supremacist bullshit. And you have to. I'm trying to think about it from the perspective of a white supremacist.
Yeah. Go ahead.
From the perspective of a white supremacist, if you are really, really a white supremacist, there are going to be things that Trump's going to say that you're going to say that's too left-leaning.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, that's going to be there.
Of course, they're going to be disappointed.
For the most part, you are going to think Donald Trump has said the things that are closest to the rhetoric that you want to hear. I don't think that's deniable.
No, I would agree with that completely, and I would add, Charlottesville is a great example of this. What happened a few years ago with Spike Lee's new film, The Black KK Klansman, about how there's a black guy pretending to be a white Klansman, and then he had a white buddy cop with him who pretended to be him so he could join the group as white. But it's based on a true story. It's really fascinating. Highly recommend seeing the film. But a black guy would do his white man's voice, and he even got talking to one of the most famous Ku Klux Klansmen. What's his name? He's still alive. Duke or I forget his name. But he even talked to like the leading Ku Klux Klan leader and met him. It was like really extraordinary. But at the end of the movie, though, what Spike Lee does that's so genius to bring it to the present is that he then shows a clip of Charlottesville, and he shows a clip of Donald Trump saying there's bad people on both sides, and it's like, this issue is not over. And I would never call Trump necessarily a white supremacist, but he's certainly using them. He's using their support, and he's fine with it, right? And that's almost worse in a way.
What do you mean by using his support, though?
What I mean is, like, he sees, okay, here's a group that's obviously not going to vote for the left, so I might as well get them to come and vote. Maybe they didn't vote in the other 2 elections, right? So,
but it's such a small percentage of the population taking the political risk to court that.
True.
I don't know if that pays
Maybe he didn't
off
think it through. I don't know. I think it's like if somebody likes him, he'll just accept it. Yeah.
I don't think he consciously did that. I don't think that Donald Trump. I'm not even completely sure that he's a real racist.
Right. It's a bit messy, but yeah, that's a debate. Right. It's not a given.
I think he's more of a. If anything, he's just closer to a nihilist.
Yeah.
He's just, he just wants to put gold all over everything.
So I think I figured him out. I think I figured out Trump. And I figured him out after he got elected, and I realized, like, holy shit, people really, really don't understand him. At least all my friends who voted against him and have this hatred against him. So I read his books, right? I went to the source. I read The Art of the Deal, which, by the way, he didn't write it, but if you just open it, you don't have to read it, just open it, you'll see it's actually, the right title would be Donald Trump's Diary, because it says 9:30 a.m. I did this, 10:30 a.m. I do this, 11:30 a.m. I do this, 12, and that's like the whole book. I sort of got, or at least half of it. I didn't finish it, but I read enough, and it's like, if you had the opportunity in the 1930s to read a book that got you inside the mind of Hitler, like, wouldn't you do that? So that's, for me, that's with Trump. Again, Trump and Hitler, totally different things. But what I mean is, I remember holding that book when he got inaugurated. And it was really tense. I was in Washington, D.C., right? And I saw a group of women who were going to do the Women's March. And I realized when I saw them that I was holding this book, which is like, like the Antichrist, the worst thing. So I quickly try to cover it, I don't want to provoke. But they already see it, right? Laser eye, eagle focus, Trump, book, this guy's a Trump supporter, da-da-da-da-da. And then we have this whole thing. But I quickly try to neutralize the situation. I'm like, I'm not a Trump supporter. I want to understand the psychology behind Trump because he's our leader now. Yeah, literally put my hands up. Don't kill me. No, they weren't dangerous, but they were scared, right? They were literally scared by this book. And that's when I realized how massive this issue is. If you're a college student at a great university and you're scared by a book, that is a problem. And it could have just been a heat of the moment and Trump got inaugurated and I'm being a little hyperbolic, but she was scared of the book. So I kind of try to assuage that a bit, but here's something that blows, I think, a lot of liberal minds. If you pick up a copy of The Art of the Deal, on the very cover by the New York Times, which is a pretty liberal, I would say, magazine or newspaper, and I like it a lot, they say one of the best business books. Like, they love it, like really high praise. So it's actually a good book. And I don't think a lot of liberals want to give any credit to Trump at all. And again, he didn't write it, but it is about his life. It's his mind. So he's very interesting. That's the first thing I noticed. He thinks very differently than most people. Secondly, this book was from 1990. I think something happened to him in the late 2000s. I don't know what. Maybe I would love to study his brain. I like neuroscience, right? I think he's got some sort of disease. I don't know. It's not a severe one, of course. He can function, but there's something with his judgment that's just off. Something's just off. Because if you look at videos of him in the late 1980s, when he's kind of at the peak of his career in a way and actually highly respected, he talked very differently. He thought very differently. He was very careful with his words, tight with his speech, unlike now. And he cared a lot about what people thought about him. And now I think he realized he doesn't need to. But something I noticed about him, though, at watching documentaries, I really studied him, is that, and this is actually why I'm terrified of him, is that I hate when people say, oh, Donald Trump is stupid, or he's an idiot. It's like, that's giving him power when you say that. That really works for him if you underestimate him. He has made a lot of deals. He has gone bankrupt several times, but he's always rebounded from every bankruptcy. And people be like, oh, well, his father's so rich. It's like, yeah, his father was very rich and did give him a lot of money. That's all well documented, all common knowledge. What people don't realize, though, is the strategy Trump took when he was kind of at rock bottom. And he went from real estate, where he's mildly successful but limited, to Trump. Just selling the name, the brand. So this is where you get Trump Steaks. This is where you get the Trump Apprentice Show, the Trump this, the Trump that. He would go to South Korea and they would be building some complex and they say, I don't have a name of what to call this. And Trump, being Trump, would say, oh, call it Trump. And they would. And he would make money off that. And he would make deals with anybody around the world, regardless of their morals. So again, ethically, he's totally, I think, bankrupt. But he's quite clever. And as soon as I saw that was the way he operated, was Trump, Trump, Trump the name, I finally got it. Like, why did he run for president? Why, if you're a billionaire, or at least you have a lot of money, it's unclear his net worth, why would you become president? It's one of the hardest jobs, super stressful. Look at Obama from 2008 to 2016, how much he aged in those years, It's a stressful job if you take it seriously, maybe. But with Trump, I'm like, I figured it out. He just wants attention. He wants his name, like Caesar, to be remembered for the rest of history. And I think he succeeded. Because people talk about him every single day. They talked about him every day before he was president. And now he's not going to just go down as, I think, as one of the worst presidents, but he's going to be the most controversial president. And no one's going to shut up about him, even after he's out of office. With every future presidential election, they're going to be like, well, at least this guy's not Trump. And it's like, he likes that. He likes attention. Stop saying his name all the time,
It'll really depend. You could be right. It'll really depend on how this whole thing ends.
Yeah.
If it does end with him being impeached,
Yes.
I don't think that is the legacy that he wished to impart, which would kind of put a little shadow on your theory about his idea of getting into the Oval Office to preserve his name. I'm sure he must have been aware that he was going to incur some legal risks that he wasn't going to incur otherwise if he attempted to become the leader of. But I'm not completely closed to your idea. I definitely think he's a narcissist who would
pretty well
want his name put next to someone like Julius Caesar's, which is just giving me a good giggle. But
for now, we'll see.
I don't know that would be the sole motivation for a guy like him. Although it sounds like you've done a little bit more digging. I don't think that he enlisted any genius creative capabilities in staying afloat. I think there were people who stood to lose a lot from him just kind of folding completely.
Sure.
And I think it's hard to say where the line between his genius is and his actual efficiency as a business leader is.
Yes.
But I will say this. He's shown a certain kind of almost efficient spontaneity. He has this ability to kind of morph very, very reliably from, this is kind of what makes him an effective politician too. He can morph from view to view. Yeah. He can look at a crowd of people and say that he didn't say something that he is on camera saying.
Oh yeah, he's very confident.
And he can just completely, if you're looking at his face, you don't detect a lie. You have to go find the video of him saying the thing.
Yes. And then he says fake news, which was brilliant.
I'm trying to figure out. Yeah. He has a certain political mobility to him that even Hillary Clinton didn't have.
True, I agree.
Hillary Clinton has had. If you think about her, she was against gay marriage in 2008.
I know. I'm aware of this. Yeah,
she came out swinging against it a couple times.
Yeah.
It wasn't just like she got confronted and said, "Well." Blah blah blah. So I view she had a lot of political mobility. It seems like Trump has more. It seems like he can promise things and not deliver on them, or he can completely promise a new thing and make someone want to now have that thing, which I guess is the salesman in him.
Yeah, for sure. He's very good at that.
I don't think, but everything you said about the left before was true. I don't think we're going to see a nuclear war because of Trump.
No, I don't think so either.
I don't think we're going to see any of the catastrophic things that the left promised was going to happen. And by the way, by promising those things, they set the bar so low for Trump that if those things don't happen, they look foolish.
Yeah, I know.
And that's why it always should have been more politically salient to attack him on his opinions, to attack him on his plan as a president, than to attack him as a person. Because some of those attacks just made it more appealing.
And yes, and all that I agree with. The thing I would add is, they didn't, and by they I mean the liberals and Hillary Clinton during the 2016 election, they didn't just attack Trump. They also attacked his supporters. And that, I think, is what lost them the election. So when Hillary Clinton says half of your supporters are deplorables, how do you think they're going to react to that?
Violently, very, very badly.
And
I remember when she made that comment, and this was one of the debates, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I can't say.
I think it was already at the point where a lot of people had made up their mind. There was probably 10, 15%. I don't know. I can't tell you. There was probably some amount of people who were undecided at that point.
Right.
I actually wonder what the content of that comment would have done. I wonder if it would have made people who were thinking about supporting Trump have a moment. I don't know. It's hard to really say because I think Trump certainly attacked the supporters of Bernie. And if he didn't do it, his supporters certainly did.
Well, yeah.
Socialism, actually, to be honest, socialism has deserved to be dragged through the mud in some very publicly voracious way because, I can't imagine a situation in which, people could be less objectively educated about the repercussions of certain things that have happened in this century. Right. Socialism does not work. Socialism does not help people. Socialism does not raise human well-being. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but I think it was good that we saw a mainstream American candidate who was really trying to spin this stuff, because I definitely think it forced a couple of people to open their eyes. On the other hand, I think there are probably 15 to 20 to maybe even 30% at sometimes people in this country who are just socialists at all times.
Right. Sure.
So,
Yeah.
who knows?
So something I found useful, and this actually ties back to mindfulness a bit. I know we went on this great tangent, and it's really interesting that, the phenomenon of Trump and all this stuff, and I really like everything you said. But I think it's really useful to acknowledge the role tribalism plays in politics, like just how entrenched these two things are, especially very recently, where it went from, like, if you look at debates from the 1970s, the 1960s, presidential debates, political debates, intellectual debates, there is a certain level of decorum. There is a certain level of respect. Motions were kind of put aside, and you would stick with the argument and you would debate ideas. And people would still do this today, but I see a lot more of emotion. I see a lot more low blows. I see a lot more of disrespect. Just a quick example on the subject of the wage gap and feminism, right? So people have been debating this today. This same debate was happening 40 years ago. And my favorite version of this was one on the William Buckley show, Firing Line. I don't know if you know him, but he would have he had a great platform, I think.
His interview with Timothy Leary, I love that.
Yeah, so he had a great platform. I was really inspired by him in a way, even if I disagree with different politics. But he had Thomas Sowell, the American economist, who's brilliant, against a leading kind of feminist figure. I forget her exact background. It's a very brief video, but I might link it with this talk, but because it's so interesting, where to the feminist credit, she was emotionless, like she kept her emotions at bay, and she just discussed the statistics, the economics, right, the ideas of the wage gap. And I mean, it's safe to say Thomas Sowell won the debate. He was very clear. He's an African-American economist, which is actually kind of rare. If you look at economics, it's a very homogeneous field. If you want to talk about like straight white men, that they dominate economics, right? I mean, we did have the first, I think, woman head of the Fed chair, Janet Yellen, recently. She's not there anymore. That was revolutionary, but it's kind of crazy when you think about how few black and women are in economics. That's a different matter. But with the wage gap, it's quite clear, if you talk to any economist, man or woman, that it's grossly misunderstood by the public. I think even Obama said, like, yeah, women make 77 cents to the dollar, and just left it at that. And I could tell he was just throwing a bone to a certain political group. But my point is that back then, though, even though the feminist woman and Thomas Sowell were diametrically opposed, and she probably was not a fan of him, they were very respectful to each other. And there wasn't as much tribalism. But today, if I talk about the wage gap, like, I have to brace myself, and I have to be very selective with my words. I need to know my audience. Even Jordan Peterson, for instance, he's a complete litmus test. I have all sorts of friends who have such a spectrum of perspectives on him, which is refreshing. And in where I live in Amsterdam, it's beautiful. You can discuss anything and people welcome it, but they'll challenge you, and that's how it should be. In America, though, sometimes, right, I say controversial things and people get really upset. So, yeah, I don't know what your thoughts are on all this, but...
Well, I think we've indulged that as Americans a lot, and I think part of the thing was this whole safe campus. Anytime where you start getting things that might turn into law or code or anything like that, like even if you just get like a little preview of what something like safe spaces on campuses would be, or who's going to get deplatformed, even when you just get a little taste of government deciding who can speak, the damage that it does to free speech is not in that person not being able to speak, but in the almost, I'm going to call this the terroristic notion of thinking, I can deplatform you if I just shout loud enough.
Correct.
Now that's holding people hostage.
Yeah,
that's really like scary. What we're afraid of terrorists doing. That if we negotiate with them, then the next time they come back, they kidnap the next little child. They'll get more money. I think that is the same mechanism in play. Yes. I noticed that when I went to college, actually, there would be all these speakers who would get booed, and there'd be all kinds of categorically bad, assertions about people before they had even, I've seen a lot of stuff with Ben Shapiro is just ridiculous. I don't agree with him on everything, but the way he's been treated has been very obviously part of this. But
yeah, for sure.
when I got to the books in classroom, I mean, we were getting taught Douglas Murray in my psychology
The
class.
bell curve,
Like,
yes. Oh,
so
that was probably that's what kicked it off.
on
Yeah.
some level, the rational, coherent pictures are still making their way into textbooks, it seems like.
Interesting.
Even when they're really, really controversial perspectives, which
Yes.
tells me that there's got to be something about the public speaking forum, or someone who essentially uses their career as a public speaker as a platform to either make money or maybe to affect social change,
Right.
that the people have a significant problem with that. And I think there's a reason for that. And it's something that you brought up, which is that a good orator can demonically draw the masses.
Yes.
People are keenly aware of that fact, a little bit more maybe than they were before the age of, say, television. And if you're more keenly aware of that fact, you might more viciously protest an enthusiastic, attractive speaker like Jordan Peterson,
Right.
coming to say things that might belittle your worldview. Now, I've seen a lot of these debates go completely sour.
Yes.
And I know that talking about these issues in public is something that can make or break someone. But I think that everyone has a certain intrinsic political motive still in saying the things that they say. I don't want to speculate too much about Jordan, but I will say with
please,
him,
I'm curious. Yeah.
I see him saying things out, is that he says that women like peanut, that always sticks, and men like things.
Yes.
And he uses this as kind of a bedrock element of how to build the rest of his continuum about how gender roles work in our current world.
Right.
And what he completely ignores, and what no one calls him on somehow, is the fact that these conditions were observed in a situation in the last 100 years where thousands of years of the subjugation of women has already been going on.
Right.
So you in a way, there is a very real way in which men have conditioned women to like people and not things, and to like the things that they want. And I feel like I'm going to even offend some feminists for saying that.
I hope not. I feel like it sounds like you're in their camp, like you're throwing them a bone here.
But coming to objective observations about what men and women want,
that's the problem.
It's just never going to be truly objective in a sense that can be rationalized in an argument the way that he likes to have those arguments. Right. So I think that gender roles, sex roles, stuff like that, they have to be examined. And, I don't even know the best way to examine them. I don't think it comes from doing case studies on men and women who have evolved in a very specific way. We're on one rung of the evolution time scale, and have culturally evolved based on the conditions that have always existed. Right. I wonder, how those studies would play out, for example, if you, instead of measuring 20th or 21st century women and men in America, if you measured, some Amazon warrior chicks from the Molosian tribes in Greece thousands of years ago, what would be different there?
Oh, so maybe
there's
a lot.
Maybe there's a reason those Amazons didn't survive, but who knows?
What would be interesting? So, I'm quite curious about the differences between men and women, the biological differences, the social differences, and so forth, and getting to the root of that, right? I can see like this is not something that I have to be cautious with who I talk about this with, but I do think I have a nuanced perspective, and I try to be
cautious about talking about this period.
Yeah. So, but I feel like I've had two different kind of conversations. In one type, I say what I'm about to say, and people are like, "Yeah, of course, that's obvious." That's usually my friends. And then there's the other side that's like, what did you just say? It's like, this is so horrible. But I'm going to try to be as nuanced as possible. And I'm going to give one disclaimer, which is I need to read more feminist literature. I need to become more well-versed in the history of the patriarchy, the history of men-women relations, because I just am ignorant on that. And until I've done my proper research, I think, on all dimensions, I should refrain from making big sweeping judgments, so I'm not going to do that. But I'm going to give an observation. So I can't talk about the past, but I can talk about the present and what I've observed. I'm taking the MATLAB programming course for neuroscientists in my master's right now at UVA. The reason I bring this up is that I feel like it was kind of like a natural experiment. So it was an experiment. Nobody designed it. Nobody's studying this. It's just me observing things. But what happened was in my neuroeconomics cohort, so neuroeconomics is a blend of neuroscience, economic psychology, looks at human behavior. It's roughly 50% men, 50% women. And that's really nice in the classroom. I'm not used to that. My background in econ and math was always dominated by men. And I thought that was a shame. I think it's good to have both and you have a good diversity of perspectives, right? Very nice. Where this gets interesting though is that in my programming course, half of it is neuroecon students, so eight men, 8 women, and then in the other half it's masters in brain and cognition, so like future kind of neuroscientists. In this group it's 90% women. And I found that really interesting. There could be, of course, many factors for this, but one of the factors that it's not is that this is obviously not discrimination. UVA didn't say, men, you can't apply, or we're only going to accept 10% of men who apply. No. This happened purely naturally. It's just interest, right? It's just for whatever reason, either because of the biological background, and there's a lot of women who study biology in college, or the psychological background. I think more women than men study psychology in various campuses. But for whatever reason, 90% are women. And I got the opportunity to sit in the programming class where we're told to do the same thing. But during the week, I spend one of the sessions with the neuroecon group where it's half men and women. And the other half, I do it with the 90% women group, or it's 90% with me being there. So it's even more than 90%. And it's so different. The ambiance is different. The way people talk to each other is different. The emotional connections are different. The levels of emotional intelligence are different. The amount of warmth and connection is different. And, it might just be, okay, fine, small sample size. The people who do brain and cognition, they're just a lot more social and a lot more emotionally intelligent. It has nothing to do with men and women. But I'm like, no, I think there's a piece to this. I think women are better than men at certain social kind of things. But in any case, I just thought it was interesting. I hope it's not that provocative or offensive for me to say this. It's just something I observed,
I can't, I definitely have that a similar quality of experience to that in a lot of ways. I think as far as I think what you're kind of getting at is that in the more part of what you're getting at maybe is that in the more mathematically driven side of this, there were less women, right?
Yes.
Am I getting that right?
True.
Okay, and in the class that was more geared towards understanding people and understanding human behavior, there were more women.
Yeah, and biology. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I think that you can certainly view that through your typical Jordan Peterson type lens,
of course,
and it's going to make some sense. It's
yeah.
going to make some sense really quickly.
Right.
I think another question to maybe be asking is why because you didn't just talk about the numbers that were in both classes.
Oh yes.
You talked about the experience of being in those classes,
Correct.
Right? That experience is subjective.
Of course, it's absolutely subjective.
You felt warm being in a situation, I'm assuming, with more women in it, right?
Of course. Part of it was a novelty factor.
How do you think the women in that situation feel? A bunch of them around, maybe not so many men around.
I bet they're pretty happy. They looked very happy. I don't mean to counter what you said. I'm just taking my one anecdote, right? This is not science.
I mean, if I'm going to go with the evolutionary biological perspective, maybe they're not that happy. I mean, if you're going with what's really, really from that.
Why wouldn't they be happy? For the sake of argument, right? I'm not necessarily disagreeing with it. Yes.
Because there's, oh man.
Here we go.
There's a limited amount of
partners, possible mates.
Partners.
Yes.
I'm not going to complete. Okay, there's a limited amount of
choice.
You know what I'm talking about. I'm not going to completely spell it. But
go on.
We're wired to think that. Now, women are less wired to think that than we are because obviously there isn't the same limitation on sperm as there is on eggs.
True. This is a real thing. Yeah.
Two totally different things.
Yes.
But viewed from that lens, Well, let's come to what an assessment of that is in terms of human well-being, for example. If we're going to go with the utilitarian perspective, let's just say we're looking at this for where is human happiness distributed.
Yes.
You could look at your class with the more women in it.
Right.
You could say that if there's a lot of women in it, if it's 90% women, and we're going with my evolutionary biological perspective, there's actually less happiness probably in that class than where it's evenly divided.
Yes. Right.
So I think that says something very interesting about the staggered, like any situations between sexes that are kind of staggered population-wise. But I'm very hesitant to indulge still. I'm very hesitant still to indulge in any notions about what women necessarily want to acquire on an intellectual level. Yeah. And I think it's also because experientially, I've met women who are very much the opposite of that.
Right, of course.
But it's not good to generalize. It's interesting. Yeah. It's hard to generalize, though.
Yes. So another observation, that was one observation I had. Another observation was I went to before I go into that, there was something you said that I wanted to respond to. In terms of the women being unhappy. So I think in this very specific situation, they don't care about finding a future partner yet. I think they just care about learning programming. So like I'm irrelevant. Like I got zero attention when I was there, by the way. I didn't I was just doing my programming. But they loved each other. So, I was happier for sure. Part of that is because, again, I'm used to classes being mostly guys. That's just kind of boring to me. And yes, I am interested in finding a future wife and things like that. So, and I feel like there's a higher probability of me finding a future wife when I'm with a room of like really intelligent, ambitious people, right? Who also are interested in the brain like I am. That's human nature to me, to be kind of attracted to people with similar interests and so forth, regardless of gender. But something I wanted to also note was when I studied abroad in France, I was in a program that had 25 women and 4 guys. And the women were definitely upset that there was only 4 guys. And the guys were definitely happy that there was only 4 guys. So you're absolutely right on that. And there I actually had conversations with women about that very thing. And like I totally could empathize in that if it was reversed, if it was 25 guys and 4 girls, like there's no way I would have a chance with any of those girls, unless I got lucky. So I would be frustrated. Then again, I'm in France, I'm in a new country, I'll talk to the locals, but that's besides the point. I totally understood why this woman was upset. So I think you're totally right on with that. Not in the programming example I gave, because it's just a different situation, but definitely in general, as an observation, I think it's quite on point. Something else I noticed, I was at a Thanksgiving dinner it was about equal men and women, but we did talk about the differences in men and women, and I listened very carefully to what the women had to say, and what was nice was the guys didn't dominate. It was actually a very balanced conversation, which was beautiful, the guys were pretty quiet.
A dream.
Yeah. So you usually write mansplaining. I totally understand where that word comes from. I've seen it many times. I wish there would still be a woman-splaining. I don't want to use the word woman-splaining because it's like, I get why people get upset when women do that because they're like, well, no, guys typically do it. And I see it all the time, mansplaining. So I'm like, fine. But at the same time, being patronizing and being condescending is a human trait. It's not one gender. But yes, it's true with a certain guy who's arrogant. There's nothing more insufferable than a guy who's in love with himself explaining to a woman her field, which she knows more about. Yeah, okay. Anyways, all that aside, what one of the women said, and it was really interesting people who were there. They're like dancers. Some were scientists, very intellectual, very interesting and thoughtful and artistic. The woman said, she's like, I feel like guys are better at shutting off their brain. As in, like, if we're watching the game, right, some sort of sport, or if we're just sitting, like, something I observed from a very young age, you get a group of teenagers together. I don't know if you've ever experienced this, but have you ever been in a room with a bunch of guys and they're literally just staring at a wall? Like, they're not saying anything, they're not doing anything, they're just chilling, right?
Usually alcohol is involved.
Or weed, yeah. But you've noticed this, right? At the risk of generalizing or making assumptions, I don't know what it's like to be in a room where it's all women and they're with themselves. I'm not there, right? As soon as I walk in, it's probably a little bit of a different
This just
situation.
All screams of 2 separate Scientology meetings.
But anyways, I can't help but think I have a hard. I'm sure it exists. I don't want to make right. I don't want to make any oversimplifications, but I have a hard time imagining a group of like 10 or 15 women just all staring at a wall with like not on drugs or anything, just kind of like or just watching the game. I know that exists, but it's just not as common. Do you see what I'm saying?
You're right.
Okay.
Well, I mean, actually,
all right, getting somewhere.
I posted something on Facebook. You got to check it out after we get done.
Yes, please.
It's a video of. It's called The Freshman Philosopher, and he comes in and he sees like his roommates are watching a game, and he's just, really, you're gonna watch that pointless game where nothing ever happens and everything in life is already pointless. So
Jesus,
pointless is even more pointless. But like, I think there's something kind of interesting about what you just said, though, because if you look at how, like, I guess sports is the most powerful example to use. Men are drawn to it in a certain way that women aren't.
Right.
It's very strange because sports are very much about people, aren't they?
Sort of. It does involve people, but there's an objective. With American football, it's very similar to war in a way. You know, there's the end zone, and you got to go inch by inch.
What about fantasy football, and they trade all these people that they know all their names?
Oh, competition. It's still, I see what you're saying, but go on. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I just think that that is actually kind of an interesting ground to examine it. I think maybe it's actually maybe a little bit simpler than either of us are making it, which is that more boys play sports than girls, so they want to watch more sports than girls.
That's part of it. I think part of it is a tribalism thing, going back to that theme, where like I think of my brother. So he's a hardcore soccer fan. He almost was a semi-professional soccer player, so he's invested a lot of time and energy into the sport and watching the sport. He's a die-hard fan of Liverpool, a team in England. And Liverpool plays every Sunday. He watches it like it's a religion, right? And Sundays, some people go to church. My brother goes to the TV to watch his team. But it's like, it's his tribe. You know what I mean? So he's very biased in that if the ref calls anything to the other team's favor, it's bullshit. Anything in favor of his team is the right thing, right? And he's very irrational in this one domain and not so much in other domains. So it's really interesting to me as like a, whatever you call me, a neuroeconomist, to just look at that and be like, okay, this is tribalism at its height. And this is true for so many Europeans, so many South Americans, so many Africans, right? Soccer is not just a sport to them. They don't see it that way. It's a way of life.
That explains the kind of things that you see at the soccer stadiums when there's a big victory.
Right, and the riots,
That's actually definitely true. You're very right about that.
And there's a lot of pain, like so much pain. If you watch a penalty kick shootout and you're in the stadium watching it, or in my case, I was in France during the 2006 World Cup final. You might have heard this, where the captain of the French team, arguably one of the greatest players who ever lived, he headbutted another player at the finals. I don't know if you heard about this. It was all over the news everywhere because this never happens ever. It's the biggest game of your life. It was the last game of his career. They probably would have won if he hadn't done it, and then this happened, right? And I was in France, and it was silent, right? This was worse than losing the final, which is like the worst thing that can happen to a country. It's just devastating because they're waiting for this to win a World Cup. And they did lose, but that wasn't what was hard. The hard part was seeing their hero do this and walk off the field. I mean, shock like seeing someone get shot or something, you know, like actual shock was felt everywhere. And it's really interesting observing that kind of stuff. So sports are interesting. Yeah.
Maybe it's just, I've always sort of also thought that it's rooted in it. Maybe sports came to prominence because we stopped killing each other less. And
it's
like
the
energy from all of that. I mean, if you look at these soccer riots, I mean, some of them, the instinct to do that seems like it's very similar to the instinct of getting ready to kill a bunch of opposing people who are trying to invade your village.
Yeah, there's some of it to there, sure.
Football has this very militaristic context to it.
Yeah, it's kind of primitive a little bit, right?
I think it fulfills a certain need.
I do too.
That some people have. I get it from other places.
But then to go back to how we even got on this subject, like why are men so gravitated towards it versus women? But I think that's just one of those things where instead of applying all these different frameworks which you can do, instead of trying to explain it, I think it would be better just to accept it and say, look, there's just some things that more guys are interested than girls and vice versa. Like chess is another very good example. I remember I saw one video, I think it was with Milo Yiannopoulos, and he's of course just a troll, but he was in a debate with this African American woman who was saying women of color are discouraged from playing chess, and it's like, yeah, I'm sure there's truth to that. On the other hand, though, it's like, how hard is it to get into chess? On one hand, if we went back 40 years, yeah, you need to find someone to play, and then if men are sexist, and there are plenty of men that are sexist, maybe they say, no, it's not even worth my time to play a woman, and they'd be a piece of shit, and that'd be very discouraging. I understand that argument. The problem is, today in the 21st century, if you're listening to this right now, and you have a computer, you can play chess with anyone in the world. And it's free, and you just go to chess.com, it's easy to remember, and you can be playing chess, and you can become as good or as bad as you want to. No one is holding you back, and actually I've heard from my last guest I had on here that he's met many great people on chess.com and made friendships, so it's quite supportive. Bottom line, I understood the woman in the argument being mad at Milo. I don't know why anyone wouldn't be angry at him. I mean, that's literally what he does. That's what he's good at, is provoking people. But on the other hand, like, he did reveal how poor her argument was. I mean, he didn't say what I said. I think that would be the strongest argument in favor that, look, anyone can play chess. But I think it's interesting that a lot of the women I know, when I mention things like chess, when I mention things like a Rubik's Cube, when I mention things, I don't know, there's other examples, those two come to mind. They're just not interested, and there's nothing wrong with that. And I don't think we should infer from that something about their brain or intelligence. They're like, no. It's just they're not interested. I mean, maybe if we look at the history of chess, it's related to war and guys like that. I have no idea, right? There's probably a whole history.
But that's the end of the conversation then.
Yes.
I mean,
exactly.
The end of that part,
yes.
And that's actually, I have no quarrel with that.
Fair enough. Yeah. No, so anyway, so this was a very different start to an episode I usually have. This is great. I like to think like this podcast has 3 phases. Like the first one is getting to know my guest, and that's what we're going to do next. And then the second phase is discussing ideas like this. And then the third phase will be like actually thinking of solutions. And, I don't think I'm at that stage yet. This is only episode 13. But to bring it all the way back to the beginning, the second question I typically ask my guests is like, I want to know more about you. Like, who is Zeke Sky? I want to get to know your history with music, with philosophy. You can approach this any way you like, but just so the listeners and I can get to know you better, just any way you like.
I guess, where should I start? I started playing guitar when I was like 11 or 12. I played for a very long time then, but then I got kind of sidetracked. I was wrestling for a long time, and I went to university to do that.
Right.
And then I stopped wrestling at university and started playing guitar, started playing in bands a little bit more.
Nice. Studied
philosophy and music. I have spent a lot of time in my life, I would say a solid 20% or 15% maybe just in the woods. That's kind of like my favorite thing to do, is so awesome. That you could actually say that that's like a defining characteristic of my life.
Wow.
And then I guess I had a choice when I graduated. I decided I could either be a clever person and maybe become a lawyer or do something in the sciences, or I could be a gritty rock and roll person, and I decided. I got my first job in like a pretty serious band in New Jersey in about, I guess that was probably a year or two after I graduated college, so I'm going to say that's 2013. And then I was playing in a lot of bands, other people's bands for a long time, not really doing much, but making enough money to kind of make a living. And then about 2 years ago, I started my own band, and that took off a little bit better. So now I've kind of gotten the opportunity to play to a bunch of people, open for some of my favorite bands.
Beautiful. We
sold a record all around the world. It was the first record I had ever released and kind of written myself. And it got, for a first record from a band, it, did pretty well. People all over the world seemed to like it.
And when did that come out, that album?
That is Animals of God and More, and that came out in July. So just a couple months now.
Yeah, that's amazing. So you're right, still writing off that. Yeah.
I do a lot of just music related work too. So I'll play alone and I'll play with my band.
Nice.
But recently I've had not like a ton more spare time, but more spare time than usual. So I've indulged the other side of things that has
Mm.
naturally been occurring to me for a long time, and which I studied a lot,
Nice.
which has been philosophy. And I've had like a renewed interest in science. Science is the kind of thing that, because there's so much good science writing out there, everyone is sort of, has the ability to learn a lot about it. But I've always had the same attitude about it as I've had about music, which is the best way to do it, to know anything about it is by doing it. And that I haven't really had the opportunity to do, unfortunately. But I'll have to content myself with, reading the best of it.
Yeah, no, that's a beautiful summation. I wanted to say before we started this podcast, I was out in town and I was going to have tea at my favorite cafe, and I found your album on Spotify and I listened to the whole thing before right before starting, and I really liked it. I'm very unexposed to that genre of music. Just real quick, I'm curious, how would you classify your music? What genre does it belong to, or does it belong to several? Because I was struggling a little bit. I really enjoyed it, but I was struggling to classify it.
Oh man, having some audio. Oh, sorry.
No, you're fine. I can edit that out. Yeah. So, how would you classify your music?
I can't. I can't
Beautiful.
piano.
Yeah.
And I get. I know what I get clumped in with, and I know what to put it out there as. The typical things are heavy metal, progressive rock, jazz, and a little bit of classical music.
Yes.
Are the things that I hear. But in terms of the music that's inspired me, it's a lot of times been rock, what you would call rock music, metal music, jazz, and classical music.
Yeah, so that combination right there, right? Those three, or you said four things, but right, that's really interesting. Because when I was listening to the album, right, I liked it, I appreciated it. I don't think I could appreciate it as much as musicians who play in metal and rock, and I don't have any experience with guitar, for instance, but I do have a lot of experience with piano. Like, I've been playing the piano for 20 years. So when I was listening to your album, it was just so beautiful when I think it was the second to last song of God and War, and a minute and a half in, I think, or 2 minutes in, I remember I was reading my book while listening to music. It was actually very good kind of background music to read to, which is kind of weird, but I like to read to whatever genres. And it would be great. A lot of the album would be great to work out to run to, right? Like, really, really good. And for our listeners, your album is on iTunes, right? And Spotify. I was listening to it, and it's totally available. Listen to it. It's really interesting. But a minute and a half into God and War, there's just this sudden transition, and you're just playing piano, this beautiful piano. And I was like, I forgot for a moment that I was listening to your album, right? It really stood out. And then I'm just like, oh man, like, I enjoyed it up until that point. But once that hit, I got into like a beautiful flow state, which is what I'm after all the time, every day. And I usually get with music and meditation, but it just happened, right? And I'm listening to that, and then I'm like, holy shit, this is Zeke. Like, this is extraordinary. And I was so shocked. I think that's part of why my brain enjoyed it so much, was it was literally came out of nowhere, right? Because I don't think there is piano in it up until that point. And so then I hear that, and I'm like, what? And I'm totally biased to the piano. I love most music that has piano in it, of any genre, but yeah, I really love that song of God and War, and I'm sure I'll re-listen to it many times. But
well, just to harken back to our previous discussion, lots of girls like that.
I'm sure I have some experience with that, but they love piano, and that kind of piano. It was beautiful, honestly.
Thank you, man.
It was really beautiful. That. How did you come up with that? How long have you been playing piano? Like, what's your process? With composition.
Piano, I started a little bit later than guitar. I'm going to say I was like 17 or 18 first time I started sitting around at a piano. My process is the same, I guess, as it is on guitar. I find things that I like playing. A lot of times I'll be sitting around doing something completely unrelated to music, and I'll hear something in my head, and I'll stop whatever it is I'm doing, and I'll either hum that idea into my phone, or I'll go sit down at the piano. It can be really inconvenient sometimes, but I always do it. And a lot of those ideas that were hummed into my phone maybe even years ago ended up finding their way to the record that we recorded a couple months ago. So, that's mostly my process. I also try to now especially a little bit more in my career that I have a little bit more free time. I just try to get as much experience as much celestial experience as I can, I guess. I'll take psychedelic drugs. I'll hang out in the woods for a long time in the cold.
Sounds very healthy and interesting.
I like doing kind of things that test my will. I think they inspire me a lot. Wow. So I'll do stuff like that, and I'm also pretty obsessive about poetry, literature, ancient philosophy. I sleep with a copy of the Iliad next to my bed.
That's awesome. I need to read that. I read the Odyssey. I have not read the Iliad, so I'll put that on my book
you gotta.
list. I'm sure it's incredible. Of course, it's the classic.
It's better than the Bible.
I'm sure. Well, I haven't read the Bible either. I want to read all the religious texts, but I would throw in the Iliad under my my next project to read all the religious texts, because why not? It's just as epic, if not more so. But so something I wanted to unpack real quick. Now, twice you mentioned the woods, very nonchalantly. I need to hear more about that. When did you first go into the woods? What experience do you have there, and why? Yeah, I'm really curious.
It started when I was young, actually. I was actually kind of a little bit, maybe too much of a danger seeker when I was a little kid. There's a story that actually my dad is also a musician. He turned it into a song one time when I was like 7 or 8, like really young. I walked into the large backyard of my grandparents. It was kind of like, I was just a place that I always hung out when I was younger. They let me go off and do whatever I wanted. And I would just pick up snakes. I would just pick up lots of snakes. And I brought one to my grandmother one day, and I'll never forget the look on her face, because she was just not very enthralled with the principle of me catching snakes. But that was like my favorite thing to do when I was a little kid, was just hang out with snakes. Super weird to think about now, but
adds to your character, yeah.
Before I understood the symbolism of a snake.
Right.
And I guess as I started getting older, my fascination was just like, I grew up, and you did too, I guess, in a time where people became increasingly more interconnected. And my response to that was not what many people's response is, which is to just be frustrated or just be angry at the internet. I took whatever kind of energy I was feeling about the internet a lot of the times, and just felt like I needed to have my phone off and be restricted in nature to my thoughts.
Yeah, that's so important.
It gives you, I think being in nature gives you the opportunity to meditate with your eyes open. Is one way
that's a beautiful way to phrase it. I'm going to remember that one. Yeah. Wow.
I've had a couple of psychedelic experiences involving nature that have completely, I would say, shifted my entire perspective on life. Some of them that like really, really, I don't even know how to put this, because I've been a skeptic for a long time of many topics of religion, but some of them just had this presence of almost like, if I took the entirety of the experience and just condensed it into a small little sentence that was this long, it would just be to say there has to be a God.
There has to be something. Yeah.
But I think it's also about what you go into. One of the reasons I went into it was I wasn't going to seek any like huge, massive thing that would be life-changing. Right. I wasn't going fishing for sharks of ideas. I was trying to go out with a little net to get those small minnow ideas, maybe even like smaller fish ideas that can kind of bring you into that all together kind of maybe add up to something significant. And it's hard to talk about psychedelics sometimes too, because people have all kinds of different reactions to them, and I cannot tell anyone that, what to do. All I can do is speak about my own experiences with them and with nature. And I think that there is, I can't prove it with science, I can't prove it in any rational way. I think there is some kind of connectivity between psychedelic experience and nature that is
no doubt.
It's very deeply rooted, and I don't think it can be explained in just logistical terms that would make any sense. It's almost like talking about dying in a way.
Yeah, it's just
like
one of those
no
experiences.
Body of reasoning that could become available to a human being.
It's experiential.
Yeah, I mean, but you couldn't really explain the phenomenon of dying. You couldn't explain. I mean, you can talk about heaven and stuff like that, but you couldn't speak of consciousness being eradicated, because we don't have anything to. There's nothing that it is to be to not be.
Yes,
you know what I mean?
I know. I totally know what you're saying. The closest thing we have to understanding death is understanding what it was like before we were born. It's like, yeah, good luck with that.
Yeah,
Your
it
brain's not
is.
going to be able to
I
compute it.
think I think being in nature reminds us sometimes of maybe the most purposeful part of being here.
Yeah, I
And
agree.
I try to gravitate to that as much as possible.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that gravitation you have is both incredibly healthy and very just human, you know? It's like I would recommend it to all of our listeners to go into nature more and not
Yeah.
leave your phone at home. I mean, if you're concerned about safety, fine, have it in your pocket, but turn it off and really don't engage. And there's so many people who are always looking at their phones, right? I think that's the most recent Facebook post I made was telling people to get off their phones, and I posted a Simon Sinek video of him talking about the addiction to stimulation and the addiction to phones, and it's getting worse with each passing generation, you know. And I mean, I'm just as suspected to the rest. I am cognizant of how much I spend time on my phone, and I might justify it, right? I might say, oh no, I'm not mindlessly looking through Facebook or playing a stupid app. I'm connecting to people for my podcast, and I'm reaching out to people around the world, and this is really positive. It's like, yeah, it's positive, except you're not putting a restraint on it. You're not saying, you know what, for 1 hour I will do that, and then for the other 23 hours I'll be off my phone. You know, that would be maybe a healthier approach, and I'm working on it. But this experience you had in the woods is so common with people who venture to do that that there actually has been scientific research done on it, and valid peer-reviewed scientific research. And I used that in a paper I wrote called "The Importance of the Environment in Society and Culture on Mental Illness." So looking beyond pharmaceutical drugs, which have positive and negative effects. And if you're taking pharmaceutical drugs right now, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not going to tell you what to do about that. What I will say is there's additional things you can do with that. And what the studies have shown, very convincing studies, if you have twins, they have found that when one lives in a city, I mean, this is just an anecdote, but when one lives in a city and the other lives in nature or in rural areas, the person in the city is 50 times more like, I mean, not 50% times more likely to have schizophrenia, to develop some severe psychosis. And that's a more severe example, but what they found as an antidote is if you live in New York, maybe that's the best example, New York City, and you're always stimulated, you're always in an urban environment, just taking one 45-minute walk in nature a week can do more for your health than probably anything, more than sleeping well or eating well. Like it's become that much of a problem. And the benefits of nature are quite well known. I would highly recommend a book to our listeners and maybe to you called The Nature Fix, and they go into really good scientific depth about how beneficial nature is for our brains. And so yeah,
That sounds like something I kind of just intrinsically know. Actually,
right,
speaking
sure.
about Sapiens, there is in the beginning of Sapiens, he discusses, which this was one of the conversations I found very useful. He talks about how at some point you get to some critical mass of 150 people can kind of work together without there needing to some kind of organized structure, and then over that you get issues. And then he just goes on to talk about how this leads to the city-state complex. And he just talks about the fact that we're not really built to live in close quarters with lots of other people with varying ideologies.
Right.
We've never really been built for that. And I think that's kind of, there's two parts to that. There's the part of that where it's true and we experience that phenomenon, we know it every day. But the idea of cultural melting pots and stuff like that, it often gets presented as if it is this new idea that is exclusive to America or something like that. I mean, you can go back. I mean, I was reading about Cyrus the Great. He lived in 500 years before Christ, and he was, I mean, he's essentially a god in Iranians and lots of people living in the Middle East. He's considered one of their greatest world conquerors ever.
Right.
And he gave the Jews a new homeland, or he allowed the Jews to go back to Judea and built them a temple. There's been this other kind of force, which is that there are people who realize, and I don't know if Cyrus was one of these guys.
Right.
There are people who realize that there are cumulative benefits for both single individuals and for societies for bringing people together in this way. So the trade-off is kind of that you might get some kind of, I want to call it kind of cultural interference from being exposed to other people's constantly and being around the internet constantly. But it's still very alleviable by simply doing what you just said, which is taking time to be on your own, taking time to find strength in solitude. That is just hopefully something that isn't lost. And I think one of the things you also said that was interesting was you said it's only going to get worse from here.
Yes.
But if you look at what happened with maybe cigarettes, there was a whole generation of parents who started educating their kids about the horrors of smoking cigarettes.
Right.
So by the time you and I get around to having kids, maybe it's going to be an exercise in just a new part of the discipline of raising a child to make them understand that they cannot just be doing this shit all day.
Yeah.
It's going to be bad for health. It's going to be bad for their relationships. It's going to be bad for their growth as a person.
Yeah. So great. All that. Great. Something to add. A problem or an issue in the world that I really care deeply about, and I'm excited because next week I just got the next guest for my podcast. She's actually doing work in this area, is social isolation and loneliness, and I think this is a direct consequence of this constant stimulation we have with our phones. It's very easy to feel lonely where on a metro or walking or being in a restaurant where everyone's just looking at your phone. It's hard to engage, and I think it can take a toll on people both consciously and unconsciously. And thinking about how the best to approach this. When I went to see Dave Chappelle, the comedian, he was in Amsterdam, and it was incredible. He's a hero of mine. I see him more as a philosopher than anything else.
Me too.
Yeah, so it was incredible to see him live. Even at this older of an age, he's just as funny as he ever was. I mean, he's really sharp. A great commentary on Dutch versus American culture is great. But when you go to see him live, he forces you to put your phone in this locked up bag. And it's really clever because I know the immediate argument people would have against that. They don't want to be separated from their phone. They'll say, like, what if there's an emergency? What if, an emergency? Probabilistically speaking, it's rare, but fair enough. So they say, if there's an emergency, or the Dutch said, and they're very practical people, if there's an emergency, get off your seat, go just around the corner, and there's a area where you're allowed to use your phone. But you have to go to a guard to unlock it for you. You can't unlock it because they know people would if they could. And then you can go to that area. You can make any phone call you want. If you feel really addicted to your phone, you can go there and go on social media. I saw some people doing that, which is kind of sad instead of talking to other people. But this is just what I saw. But the point I'm like, that is an example of an intervention you can do. So for concerts, I would go one step further, though. Any cafe you go to, if you're with friends or restaurants, it's like, just put your phone in a basket, put it somewhere out of reach, and just be present with who you're with. I find it so disrespectful when I am eating dinner with somebody, not just like having a snack or a drink, but dinner, and they're looking at their phone when we haven't seen each other in a while. And it's like, can't that wait a little bit? Is it really urgent? They might even say something like, oh no, it's my mom, and that might sound like, oh, that's fine, it's their mom. Parents are important, but it's like, no, it's like 8 p.m. Do you need to be texting your mom right now? Is she okay? Or it just doesn't feel right to me. I don't know. It's good to kind of segregate these things a little bit.
I don't know the extent to which that is related to... I'm not completely convinced of the relationship between that and human wellness. What I would say is that there is something that is in the collective unconsciousness that makes people extremely fixated on being able to understand things that are going on far away from.
Yeah.
Some people are more fixated on it than other people are.
Right. That's right.
And if I'm going to be completely honest, I think those people fall into one of two categories. Either there are pressing things that demand their attention a lot, which, not to be a jerk or anything, there are times where I really, really need to be minding my phone at. And then there's another situation, which is the one I think we're really talking about, and I think that this actually stems from a certain brand of insecurity that would have maybe manifested itself in a different way had cell phones not been around.
Right.
It would have manifested itself in some kind of general distraction or inability to maybe even converse and focus on the conversation that you're having. The instinct to pick up your phone and look into the phone is only brought about by it ringing or by you seeking out something from it.
Correct. Yes.
You're seeking out something aside from the experience that you're just sitting down and having. It's difficult to attribute it to anything besides that search for some other thing that is meaningful in your existence, which kind of makes what you're saying even more damning, because if that is the case, then that person's not giving you, the attention that you deserve as their friend.
A little bit. Yeah.
So I also don't, I don't know. This is certainly something that there isn't any reasonable solution to. I mean, for Dave Chappelle, and you have the kind of draw where you can get people to abandon
it's a
their
big
cell
event,
phones to see you.
concert, sure.
That's one thing.
Of course.
I do think that we can all, each as individuals, just do our best to be conscious of this.
Yeah, that's a good step.
The best way to be conscious of it is when it happens to you, though.
Right.
You don't get conscious about it when you're on your phone.
When you're doing it to others.
Conscious about it when it happens to you and you think that you deserve more attention than you're getting. You know what I mean?
Yeah. It really depends. I also realize the degree to which I'm irritated, right? I never make a scene or yell at my friend for doing it. I just kind of see it, get upset, but then just keep it inside. And maybe that's unhealthy, but I should probably say something. But maybe I should tell them after the fact. But it also depends what they're doing with their phone, I noticed. So, for instance, my best friend, who I've known since I was 4 years old, he knows this is a personal problem of mine, and I get really irritated when people get their phones in social situations, like parties or whatever. And of course, it's beyond my control if I'm at a party. I'm not going to fucking hijack a good time and be like, you're on your phone, and you're on your phone, and put it away. No, fuck it. You want to be on your phone? Fine. I'll go find someone else to talk to. It's not a big deal. But what he would do to piss me off one time, it's kind of a funny incident in retrospect, but we were having dinner, or lunch together and eating, and everything was great. And then he pulled out his phone on purpose and he started playing a fucking game, right? He wasn't to reach out to somebody. It wasn't even a compulsive need. He just was bored, I guess. And I guess we had stopped talking, and he knew that it would annoy me, right? So I come up with a good response. I don't call him out on it. I don't give him the satisfaction he wants of me making a scene or being upset. I just get up and walk out the door of the restaurant. And as I'm walking out the door, he looks up. He was not expecting that move on my part, because no one does that, right? You just wait till your friend's up. No. Get rid of the power, right? Walk out. It's a power move. And then when I'm open the door, right, he doesn't want to be alone, right? This kind of ties back to loneliness. He doesn't want to be alone in this thing playing his game, right? And he was supposed to be with me. I mean, the whole reason we're together is to hang out. So he sees me walking out the door, and he knows, right, I'm bipolar, and bipolar people can be a little eccentric and unpredictable. So there's probably a part of this thinking, is he actually leaving? He's actually just fucking done with me and leaving? That would not be beyond Thomas to do, to actually just leave. So I think it was a possibility of that got his attention. He woke up, but he's like, what are you doing? I'm like, oh no, we can go now. Obviously, we're done with this. Yeah, you're about to be lonely in actual real life. Yeah. So let's go. And that worked. And then he never did that again. But, so it's funny. He was doing it to fuck with me, but I think I won in the end, whatever that means. I think you did, Thomas. Yes, thank you. So that's my strategy but that's a severe situation. Fortunately, I've never been on a date actually with a girl and have my date do that to me. So that's really nice. I have. And what did you do? You probably didn't say anything. It depends on where you're at. Of course. That girl is if that girl's kind of your girlfriend or something like that, and she's just always on her phone, that's just. It's just such a pain sometimes. But if you're on a first date with a girl and she's on her phone incessantly, that's just I'm gonna just be polite, and then I'm just gonna not speak to you again, because I already have an understanding. It's more annoying when you're in a relationship with someone and when you're in a relationship with someone, you already come to terms with some of the issues that they might have. You're already making some deal of compromise. So it's just one of the new things you kind of have to swallow about that person. That they're constantly on their phone or something like that. It's really. But I should try what you tried. It sounds like a good strategy. I think it's pretty effective, because you're not saying anything, right? And it's not. Maybe some people would quantify that or qualify that as passive aggressive, but I don't think it is. I think it's a statement, and it's speaking without words, it's an action. And I like to study persuasion and just like what changes people's minds and what I just like creating different responses from people. I like getting people out of their mindset when they're not.
You're dangerous,
I'm
dude.
so dangerous, yeah.
I don't know if we should be friends.
You know that what you're saying though, this actually happened to me very recently. So I went to a I don't know what your views are on postmodernism. I never knew that much about it. I knew that Jordan Peterson has this really big thing against it, and when I look it up on Wikipedia, I just get confused. It seems kind of convoluted, and it's a whole debate. And I know there's a debate between scientists and postmodernists back in the 90s, but I still don't really get it, right? So I'm like, oh, here's an opportunity at my University of Amsterdam. There's a presentation on postmodernism. I can maybe learn something about it, you know, and I'm going to try to go into it without judgment. I'm just going to listen. I'm not going to say anything, obviously not mention Jordan Peterson. I'm not there to provoke, to learn. So they do their presentation, and I really don't learn that much, but that's not the fault of postmodernism. That's just more the fault of the nature of the presentation. It wasn't like a TED Talk. It wasn't a big presentation. It was more students just talking about books they like in postmodernism, and yeah, so it was kind of a low-key event, and it's free. And then during a coffee break, I talked to one of them, and she asked me a very simple question. What do you study, right? The common question. So I say I'm doing a master's in neuroeconomics, but then I went one step further and I said, I want to get a PhD in the subject and look at persuasion. And usually when I tell people that, they're curious at the very least. I don't know if they're pro or con, but they're curious, right? You don't hear that very often. She had a very different reaction. She started to show physical symptoms of fear. So she looked very uncomfortable. I'm assuming, but I think I can say with confidence that her amygdala might have been a bit activated, the part of the brain that when you're fearful and fight or flight. And then she proceeds to say something that no one, Zeke, in my entire existence has ever said to me. And this was like a week ago, so I've been telling everyone this story. It's really on my mind. But she says, I think you're capable of doing great evil. And she said that with complete sincerity. Because I said I want to study persuasion, and she saw that as dangerous, right? Okay. Yeah. So then we had one of the weirdest conversations I've ever had. This lasted a total of 2 minutes, this whole exchange, but a lot happened in that 2 minutes. So I decide to play with this a little bit, right? So I go, do you agree that helping people in extreme poverty is a good thing? She's like, yeah, of course. Like, the most disenfranchised, the most oppressed people use their language a little bit. Do you think that's a good thing to help them? She's like, yeah. Now I said, what if I persuaded somebody to help people in poverty, to help people who are oppressed? And then she got really defensive and she went, well, no, who are you to say that? I'm like, okay. Who are you to decide what's the right thing to do? And I'm like, that's a fair question. Yeah, who the fuck am I, right? Okay. I mean, we're really going deep here just after meeting each other. But I go, but wouldn't it be beneficial to persuade others to be more selfless and to help people? And she said, no, it's wrong. It's wrong for you to persuade. I'm like, okay, because it's subjective and it's a power move, right? She's like, yeah, everything's subjective. There is no truth. I'm like, okay. A lot of people, I brought up Hitler. I said a lot of people don't like this Adolf Hitler guy, right? I mean, he did a lot of terrible things. She's like, yeah, but I'm like, but of course, Nazis really liked him. And so there's some people that see him as a terrible person, but there's also some people who really liked him. She's like, yeah, that's true. And I'm like, but most people really think Hitler was a bad. He was evil. He caused a lot of suffering, and he killed a lot of Jews, or was partly responsible for that. And he's a bad person. And she's like, yeah, I guess so, but still, it's subjective. And I'm like, man, she is really stuck on her ideals. And what it reminded me of, Zeke, was kind of talking to somebody in Scientology or somebody in a cult. I realized there was no getting through here. That was the most clever and most charitable way I could be before giving any insults, and I'm not going to do that. That was not my purpose of being there. So then we just kind of stopped our conversation there. But she was uncomfortable the entire time, and I get it. I was totally challenging her entire worldview, essentially, and the way she sees the world. I mean, she's pretty invested, I think, with this postmodernism stuff, whatever that means. And at the end, though, to break away from her while being polite, I said, look, we just met, and I'm having to defend myself of not being an evil person to somebody I haven't met before. And I'm like, that's a really difficult thing to do. I'm not really prepared. So I'm just going to call it quits here. And she apologized, to her credit. I don't think she's a bad person. But it was a very uncomfortable experience and very bizarre. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Oh, wait, sorry. The audio is out a little bit.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. What were you going to say?
postmodernism is one interesting bubble to look at this through.
Sure, please.
Now, not to say that it's not a very specific bubble, but I mean, you're going to want to remember when you're looking at something like postmodernism is that it is a place. Postmodernism is almost like a little machine that can take any kind of belief that has come as the result of like some grand unifying theory, and it can take it and just kind of dissolve it by virtue of postmodernism, by virtue of let's not have
what it does.
any grand unifying theories about anything. And it's a very, if you think about this specific one, it is one of the most obvious responses you can think of to the fact that human enlightenment has gotten to a higher stage. It's just a skepticism, if you really think of post. I mean, I don't know what exactly. It's a certain skepticism, right?
I see what you're saying.
About the truths that we can come to by virtue of. I mean, there's all kinds of other places you'll find this. Like, I would say logical positivism is almost like
I've heard of that too.
Are you familiar with that movement?
Sort of. I know I've heard of it, but not have it properly defined or conceptualized.
Well, logical positivism was essentially this highly, almost militant brand of scientific skepticism that cast doubt on how people did experiments, and say actually some scientists joined the ranks of these philosophers, and they were pretty popular in Vienna in the 1930s, especially when relativity was becoming the new language of physics. And it just expresses a certain level of skepticism of how scientists do experiments and how they come to conclusions and stuff like that. And it gets really, really bizarre. Some of it's really interesting, and I'm just going to point it out for a second. So
please do it. No, I'm very curious.
Postmodernism. But I read one author called Karl Popper. His whole thing.
Yes, I know him.
Yeah, he's essentially tells us that since human beings seek out the experiments they want, and they get funding from people who are also human beings, and they choose the staff they want and the conditions of the experiment, they ultimately sometimes get the results they want. The whole thing is just a giant temper tantrum against our ability to do rational inquiry on things that go on. But as it relates to postmodernism, this kind of specific brand of it, I think what you're generally going to see are people who have a certain existential disposition to a way of life. I'm not going to single anyone out, but people who really want something to be true, one specific thing to be true. And it requires disabling the mechanism, which proves lots of other things to be true that might be against what that one thing that they want to be true is. So if you're already starting with the assumption that some of these people are going to be that type of person, I think it's very obvious you're going to see people really quickly who are going to be real. I mean, if they're going to be this, they're going to commit their lives to a belief that goes against general rationale in general, which is what I would say about a lot of postmodernism. I haven't read enough to say that's everybody, but I do know enough to think that it is kind of a barrier between parts of science that are really, really useful. I mean, especially just things like if there is any such thing as a grand unifying theory, which I don't know if there is. And if we listen too much to postmodernists, we're not going to go about trying to find it.
Yeah, to me, like at the risk of oversimplifying, but that's just what I do. That's how I parse things together and get understanding. Like I whenever I say make a big generalization, people like, you're making a big generalization. I'm like, I know. Yeah, I have to make certain assumptions because else you don't get anywhere. And what it reminds me of, I had a joke about. Let me tell the joke, and then I want you to tell me if it's in any truth. But I have a postmodernism joke, which is like, let's say Derrida, just for instance, the French philosopher, he's in a car and he's speeding, and a police officer pulls him over, and he says, "You're going 30 miles over the speed limit." Derrida would say, "Oh, I don't interpret it that way." So I didn't do anything wrong, And so, look, I haven't read any Derrida. I've read about him a lot, but I haven't actually gotten into his work. One thing that really worries me, though, is that I did date a girl, actually, who was a postmodernist, and she's really into Foucault and really into Derrida. And I asked her, and we were good friends. I mean, now we're not. It didn't work out, but at the time we were good friends, and I was genuinely curious. This was like before Peterson was really attacking postmodernism. It's just something I'd heard once, and I looked it up on Wikipedia, and I was just confused. And so I asked her about it, to explain Derrida or to explain postmodernism, and she said, Thomas, I can't explain it. And I'm like, but you study it. Like, you do a lot with literary theory and with post-structuralism and with Foucault and all
She's
this
a
stuff.
programmer?
No. She was a literature master's student, and she did a lot with post-structuralism, and she really liked postmodernism, but she said, you would need to talk to my professor. I can't explain it. And to me, that sounds like a failure in teaching, or at least the source material is so complex that people are then liking it because it's complex. And I'm very critical of that. I don't know, but maybe I'm wrong. I don't know.
I don't know. I don't know. It's not something that I don't really completely have an opinion on that. Yeah. I'd have to know a little bit more about her.
Yes.
I'd be interested in hearing from more of the postmodernist types on issues like that.
Me too.
But another thing that just makes me, I don't know. People have different interpretations of postmodernism too. So can you tell me like a little bit more about like how she said she came about being a postmodernist?
So her angle is more through literature. So there's a piece she had me read that was very thought-provoking, but also pissed me off because maybe I'm like a literature nerd or really like reading. But have you heard of the piece called "The Death of the Author"?
No.
Okay, so I don't know precisely how this fits into postmodernism, but I know it does somehow. Maybe post-structuralism would be a better framework. But in any case, basically this piece is about how authors don't matter. All that matters is the reader's interpretation. And I was personally triggered by that because I love authors. I want to be an author. But I was also telling her, I'm like, just from a very simplistic reducto, proposition, very reduced, if authors didn't exist, readers wouldn't exist. We wouldn't have any text. You have to have an author to then create something, and then you can interpret it. Now, I think readers, especially those at a master's level, because that's her, I was aware of the audience I'm talking to. I'm not going to shit on readers, but quite the contrary. We need people to criticize. We need people to really read deeply these authors and parse it together and think about it and give good criticism. That's very important. But to then remove any significance from the author himself, that's when I really was like, okay, I can kind of see why I really don't like this. But I don't know if you've heard anything like that. But...
No, listen, my encounters with postmodernism come from, I don't know if you know this, but I mean, since they're so, in some sense, they're against self-referential subjectivity, you get it in music. You get it in people who will say that, I mean, you'll even get some of them who will say that art isn't really a real thing.
Whoa.
All there is the worship of art.
That's a deep one. That's a tough one, but I would love to have a debate on that. Holy shit, what a statement.
It depends on how you define art. I'm not necessarily going to have a quarrel with that. But what I'd say is this. That comes from a broad tradition of skepticism, the comments that she gave you. Yes. Now, postmodernism comes from, I think, a reaction to totalitarianism that existed. It's gone on for a while in various forms. It's been called postmodernism now, but I think it's a reaction to a typical thing about what kind of the Western narrative of very much sex roles and gender roles.
Yeah. They look at all the problems that the Western world's done. They can look at imperialism. They could look at colonization. They can look at totalitarianism.
But it's not really a perspective on those things because it's relativistic. It's epistemologically and morally relativistic.
So what does that mean? Yeah, for listeners.
It's what does what mean?
Morally relativistic. Yeah.
It is morally relativistic. Right. I think that if you look at postmodernism and you metastasize it into something that's actionable as a formula, it's a framework for maybe no right or wrong.
Yes.
Maybe more of a situationally based kind of perspective of right and wrong.
Okay, I see what you're saying now.
Well, because the enemy to them is seeing some kind of objective Western rationality and reason.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So, I mean,
very good,
what's the opposite to that? I mean, you're going to find some of them where they're going to be Buddhists. You're going to find some of them. I mean,
those I would be friends with, the Buddhist postmodernists.
You could be a great postmodernist Christian.
Interesting.
You couldn't be a great one.
You could be a good, but you could reconcile the two.
Ideologies that are, And if you look at like a utilitarian, like let's take like a John Stuart Mill or even a Sam Harris, if you look at the framework that they propose for how morality, say, should exist, it's so completely different from that. There's a very objective set.
There is right and there is wrong. Yeah. Well, and I totally subscribe to Sam Harris's view. I mean, not totally, not to 100%, but I think it's impossible. What he's trying to do is TED Talk about how we need to have a scientific view of morality, and there's right and wrong, and he wrote a whole book called The Moral Landscape, which I thoroughly enjoyed. But I can totally see why it maybe pissed off some people, or why people were like, no, this is not possible. Science does not belong in the morality domain. And fair enough. I'm not going to have a strong opinion one way or another in that, but I do think in similar ways to Sam Harris. I'd be lying if I didn't say his writing and his speaking and his podcast did not influence the way I think. But I haven't heard him debate
rational, realist, utilitarian. He has a certain perspective, you must admit, to anyone who's a millennial.
I haven't picked up on that, but I'm sure if I re-listened to his podcast, I would notice that. Go on.
Think about the state of knowledge that we grew up in. Think about the ability that we can use Wikipedia. Think about the ability that we can see videos and of all kinds of. We can watch Animal Planet for hours and learn things. This is the age of being able to learn things.
True.
This
it's
is
never
the
been
age
easier.
Of being
it's
able to have
more
a
complete.
rationalist perspective and seem like the most sane person in the room as a utilitarian.
Okay.
That's what I think.
Yeah, I agree. So go on.
Well, there's a certain clear-headedness to that that's like really, really appealing.
Yes.
And the fact of the matter is, if we're going to kind of move to Sam Harris and utilitarianism and stuff like that, when you establish a collective moral framework of any sort, you're going to get backlash from certain people.
Of course.
And that backlash is in no way a measure of whether or not your idea is applicable to their discipline. So, for example, if Sam Harris wants to say that science can tell us something about morality, it doesn't give someone like Lawrence Krauss or Neil deGrasse Tyson any special ground to say no. That's impossible. You're wrong.
They're not going to fight him on that. Yeah, they're not. They don't.
Well, no. Some of them did. I mean, lots of people do fight him.
But I mean, Neil deGrasse Tyson though, and Lawrence Krauss.
Oh no, I'm not being literally them. But I think what is important is the distinction between rationality and science is something we should continue to keep exploring because, first of all, as the state of science changes, it's undeniable. That as science has changed, morality has changed, and there is some type of correlational or maybe even causal error.
Yeah, sure. I'd love to investigate.
That doesn't mean that you can really generalize about the two. But as the state of technology has improved, as the state of doing science has improved, human well-being has improved. What is the mechanism behind both of those two things? Is that mechanism related to the execution of both of those things? If so, how? That's a very reasonable question to ask. And it is certainly reasonable to assert that there are certain principles about the Enlightenment and just the fact that we can even have you ever read any Peter Singer?
I have, yes.
Okay, just the fact that a guy like him can come around and convince a couple people that maybe he's right tells us something new about the human ethical paradigm.
Yes.
Something has changed.
Right.
I don't like separating the issues in terms of can science tell us something specific about morality. I think it's more interesting to ask, what are the ways in which science and morality are intertwined, and can we expose them for a better understanding of both? And here's one thing I was going to bring up to you.
Please do.
I'm glad we got to this.
Yes.
And it's this kind of notion that there's this very infinite universe to expand, to kind of explore with, all of our modern techniques. And that universe is massively expansive, obviously. But all that an expansive universe actually means is expansive human experience. An infinite universe implies infinite possible human experience, implies infinite sentient being experience. Sure. That's why science and religion, in some ways, are tied for all of eternity. And you could think of one way to think about it is science and religion as having this failed courtship.
Yes.
Because you can look at even like Galileo was sanctioned by his. There's all kinds of examples of the church really trying to harbor in science and rein science in.
Of course.
Bring it under.
It's a threat.
So the repercussion of that bad breakup, and that bad breakup started, I'm going to say right around Copernicus.
Yeah.
But
Right, saying that we're not the center of the universe. That's a big one to dismantle.
Which I mean, and then Newton is an interesting one because he was a religious man, but he was a psychopath, so I don't really.
Well, what I like to say about Isaac Newton real quick is that I've studied him a lot. He spent more time trying to turn lead into gold than inventing calculus, and he spent more time trying to determine when Jesus would return to Earth than he did on the laws of physics. So I
know, that's why I'm saying he was a psychopath.
Well, I don't know if he was a psychopath, but he was very ill. He had a lot of mental problems. Psychopath could have been one of them. He did not have a healthy life. We can say that at least. But from what I've studied of him, it's interesting because on one hand, scientists are going to say like, oh, he was one of, if not the greatest scientists who ever lived. But imagine what more he could have accomplished if he wasn't spending so much time in alchemy and trying Jesus to return.
Well, but then, I don't know. Yeah. There was nothing more to accomplish at that time. He gave us.
Yeah.
I don't know what further he could have done.
Right. It's an unknown.
My point here is that the relationship between science and religion can be viewed through the lens of potential human experience of the universe. They are. I mean, I don't even want to say religion there. I want to say morality. Yeah. I want to say that those two are tied up in a way that makes a total divorce in some ways completely impossible. As our understanding of the universe expands, our potential experiences expand.
Absolutely.
So I think it's important to be conscious of that. I don't like how many people go about moral truths outside, honestly, of most. It is very hard to get a stable moral framework from.
Sure.
Or
wait, what are you saying?
One that you really can you hear me?
Oh no, sorry, I interrupted slightly. What was your question?
I was asking you if you had a moral framework which you feel really comfortable with, or
I don't know if I would say comfortable, but there is one I've been playing with quite a lot, and it's kind of funny because the T-shirt I'm wearing right now. I'll just move the camera down. I don't know if you can read this. But effective altruism was largely based on the morality philosophy of Peter Singer. I wouldn't say he's the leader of the movement, but he certainly had an influence. There's a lot of debate within the effective altruism community. So I don't know if anyone's gone about saying, okay, this is our moral framework, but it does certainly have a utilitarianism bent to it. That's undeniable. The degree to which varies within effective altruism. I'm working in community building within the Netherlands group, which is really nice. The Netherlands are like super nice guys. I think they're much more balanced and have a good work-life balance compared to effective altruism in America, for instance. Usually the biggest problem with effective altruism and the utilitarian philosophy they carry is that they come from too narrow of backgrounds. So most of them are interested in artificial intelligence and programming and philosophy and in economics. But we're missing out on artists. We're missing out on people from the humanities. For the most part, we're missing out on a diversity of people. I mean, right, it is a lot of straight white men, and usually I get annoyed when people say that, but it's like, it's true. If you're a woman, and especially if you're a woman of color, and you went to one of our meetups, you'd probably feel alienated because you walk in and it's a bunch of nerdy white dudes, and that's just uncomfortable. And I want to change that, not just for the sake of having diversity, but for the sake of just having different ideas, because at the very root of it, it's a philosophy, and we debate each other constantly. So to answer your question though, I was having a very long talk with two artificial intelligence philosophy guys last night or 2 nights ago. I was at an AI safety dinner, and I was trying to sell them on effective altruism, but they would ask me pretty good critiques, right, or trepidations they have. And it's like the underlying philosophy is like, it's possible to do the most good. So when you do moral things, when you do altruistic things specifically, there are better altruistic things than others. You can kind of quantify it to an extent, and that's where people get uncomfortable. So charity is the most obvious example. Some charities are much more effective on a certain metrics than others, right? So we have economists, PhD economists from good institutions at the GiveWell organization that's tied with effective altruism, and what they do is they say, look, there's so many charities, right? They're donating aid to Africa and various causes, but so few of them are very transparent in what they do with that money. And so few of them take a rigorous evidence-based approach to when they're giving money and identifying solutions. And so few of them are critical of themselves. They think, well, we're doing a good thing, right? Morally, we're helping others, but they fail to consider how effective they're being. So that's where effective altruism comes in. And so if you look at an organization like Against Malaria Foundation, to name one, This one's really heavily endorsed by the effective altruism community. So much so that the co-founder of Facebook, Dustin, I forget his name, he's worth about $10 billion, I believe. I forget his exact amount. He just came out and said he's going to put all his money into effective altruism, which is a really big deal, right? Now we're in the big leagues, right? This is $10 million within his lifetime and his wife's lifetime. So I see that as very exciting. I could see how some people would be upset by that. It's like, really, 10 billion to one organization. But the thing is that effective altruism, it's not just a nonprofit. It's not just an organization. It's a global network of Oxford, Harvard, MIT, whatever, scientists throughout. And now it's expanding to more people. I would say there's 1,500 hardcore members in it who have pledged to give 10% of their future income to what they see as effective charity. So the reason why I'm so involved is that, like, I'm realizing how much power and influence and money they're quickly getting, and that it's very important that I instill a certain ethics and that I communicate with leaders in the movement and make sure they don't get carried away, you know? So it's very interesting. But if you have any questions about effective altruism, let me know. I am becoming more and more informed, but still don't know some things, and critical of some things.
Yeah.
But it's a big deal.
So my perspective of coming at this is, I generally give to people that I see.
Yeah. That's so real.
Peter Singer. Yeah. So Peter Singer would have a thing or two to say to me.
Of course. He's extreme. He's definitely extreme.
I also make sure I don't buy any really expensive suits.
Nice. Well, that's
so
good.
I'm
in favor of that.
So I don't have to worry about jumping in the water to save that baby and a suit.
Yeah, I'm glad you're well versed with him, at least. Yeah, that's good.
What?
I'm glad at least you're well versed with Peter Singer, so you know some things.
Yeah, you know, he's he totally compelled maybe more people than almost any philosopher in the last 50 years.
Yeah.
He made more people vegetarians. I mean, like, I meet these, like, I'm not trying to be mean, but I meet some really, really airheaded people.
Sure.
Some really not all that bright, all there people. Who they're just like, oh, Peter Singer, I love Peter Singer. I'm like, okay, so you're a vegetarian, right? You're trying to be skinny bitch, right? Sorry. That's like...
I have my own beef, by the way, with vegetarian. There is a part of effective altruism that's big on animal welfare, and they require veganism, but I'm not a vegan. I'm not a vegetarian, just for the record.
Well, I think that... I think that altruism, I don't know enough, but I think that altruism is, in its pure form, kind of transactional. It's one thing that I noticed about it. I've heard people interviewed on several occasions, some disciples of Peter Singer, who are committing to give away everything they make down to like $22K a year for themselves.
Just bare minimum. Yeah, those are the hardcore effective altruists that exist, yeah.
I think that if you get to the point where you are a utilitarian of that sort, I don't see what the other choice would be.
Yes.
You'd have to give away everything that you possibly could. But
that's how some think, yeah. As I said, extreme.
One of the places where this is a really interesting environment is, I think that if all of that is true, which I think some of it is true, it says something about money and well-being that is extremely interesting.
Yeah, go on.
And not just interesting because it doesn't just tell us something about what well-being is compared to how much money we make. What it also says is something about the political ideologies that are based on redistribution.
Right.
What it says, I mean, if you're a socialist, for example, or a communist, and you really believe that wealth really needs to be redistributed, you really believe that human happiness is defined by how much money you make.
Right.
And that is a disastrous proposition.
Yeah.
It is disastrous to tell people who are already not making a very, great amount of money in their lives. It is disastrous to tell them that they would be way happier if they made double that amount. That is just like the opposite of what I want to tell human beings in America.
Of course. It's the most
if you make $55,000 or more a year in America, you're in the top 1% of the planet.
Yep. Yeah. Even less
now
than that.
Now that is, if you think about that.
I do a lot,
it's insane when you think about it, because we still have people in this country who make that or above who think that their standard of life is very low.
Right. So this is a psychological domain. I know a lot about it. Something I want to just add that I think you'd find really interesting. So there's some behavioral economists. I've done some work in behavior economics, really look at human irrationality, and they've studied money and happiness. And they found something really interesting when they quantify it. I don't know how peer-reviewed this is, but it is thought-provoking. Once people get to $70K a year on average, they stop getting more happy as they get more income. There's something about the 70K limit that you can travel for a few weeks during the year. You can kind of, you can be happy. I mean, in the sense that you don't want more. But then there's this contradictory thing. This is where our brain is so complex, where everyone wants twice as much as what they have. So if you make 50K a year, if you had 100K a year, think about what you could do. You get that nicer car. You can go on more vacations. You don't have to. You can splurge on dinner without worrying, right? But then it's like, well, what if you have 100,000? Well, imagine if I had 200,000. I could get an even better car, better home, right, and so on and so forth. Even when you're at $1 billion, people want more. There's no limit to human greed at any level. Now, that doesn't apply to everyone. There's exceptions. I hope I'm an exception. But it's true, though. There is this appeal where no matter what, if you look at the richest people, they could always have a bigger house. There's always the next thing. In the future, it's going to be, I want a home at Mars, or I want to go on a space flight into outer space. I want to take the Virgin shuttle into outer space. That's what the wealthiest people will be doing next in the future. Or taking the Bezos, whatever, Blue Origin, rocket, or take the Musk SpaceX rocket. But there's no shortage to that, And so what I personally want to dedicate my life to doing, and hopefully through this podcast and other means and in person, is to instill meaning into people, to say like, okay, yeah, money, there is a relationship to happiness to a certain degree. I'm not going to tell somebody who's really poor that money doesn't buy happiness. I think that's a really kind of cruel thing to say. They would definitely benefit from more money. But what I would say is there's also a lot of super wealthy people who have their entire identity built on that wealth, and that if you take away any of that, their entire being collapses. And to have an extreme example, and in Tony Robbins' book I read about money, my dad was offended when I was reading it because he's like a doctor, and I can always like, how can you read a book on money? I'm like, Dad, you complain about money constantly. I think if you read it, you'd be making more. But the bottom line is this: there's a guy who's worth $10 billion, and in the Great Recession, he lost 90% of his wealth. But he still had $1 billion, right? So most people, they hear that story and they're like, oh, what, this poor billionaire only has $1 billion. What a poor guy. Oh my God. He committed suicide. He jumped in front of a train and killed himself. Yeah. His entire imagine though, if you invested all your time into a book and then somebody just ripped it off or just deleted. So like all your identity was on a book and then you lost 90%. That would be devastating. I think that's what happened to him psychologically with the money. He lives and breathes money, 100-hour weeks. This is all he does. And then he loses 90% and he forgets about, he had kids, by the way. He forgets about his kids, it's tragic to the most extreme. Forgets about his wife, is so overwhelmed by that loss, his brain can't handle it, kills himself. So that's extreme, but it's an example.
I think that's not exactly exclusive to money. I actually have
I don't think so either.
Similar theory about climate change.
Oh, okay, go ahead. Yes.
I think if it can be shown that climate change is a hoax for any reason, and I'm not saying that is the case.
It's just
there are millions of people whose lives are purpose.
Oh my God, you're so right. This is so true.
So
They're so invested.
It's like people invest a lot of their time in either getting knowledge, or money, or beliefs, and it's just not. If you become too invested in any of that,
any identity,
it's likely to be devastating.
I agree.
This goes to an epistemological notion, though, and almost like a Buddhist kind of notion of attachment and stuff like that.
Right.
I mean, it's the degree to which you're attached to the things you know, the money you have, the things you want to be true. If you're so significantly attached to those things, I mean, I can't get in the mind of that guy who killed himself. But
no, neither can I. I can never be in that mind.
The best I can say is that he was too attached to
it. Yeah, that's one explanation. I mean, that's true. I have no idea what was going on in his head. I was actually pretty shocked by that story. I don't think many people know about that story. I'm
gonna check that out.
Yeah, no, please do fact check it. That's just from a book I read, but yeah.
All right.
But I think, it's easy to be unsympathetic, though, to people who are very wealthy. It's easy to be unsympathetic to people who are very powerful. This kind of goes back to the whole oppressor-oppressed dichotomy that I really hate because I just think it's too overly simplistic. But I'm trying to find a way to tie this all together. I do have a party I have to go to in like 15 minutes, but I'm trying to, we've talked about so many things. It's like 7:18 p.m. It's
Okay.
just a housewarming party. I'm not in a rush or anything. I just know for our listeners, like, because it's been like over 2 hours of conversation, so I'm trying to see though a good way to conclude everything we talked about. I think we've talked about so many fantastic things, but maybe if you have like a message to our listeners, I don't know, they've just been kind of bringing in a lot, and we've talked about so many topics, but it seems like both music and philosophy have had a huge influence on your worldview and framework, but also maybe to tie back into what we mentioned about identity. If any message you have with our listeners of a way for them to be healthier, or just a different mindset, maybe. I don't know.
I guess I would just say, for me, the thing that I think is most helpful to human happiness is examining that you are, a thinking thing, and that you are not exactly the same as the things that you think. And if you can minimize the amount of negative input that comes from things like that are more modern to us, like social media and if you can minimize the amount of stress you get from our modern world, that's a good first step in becoming happy. Then the other thing is dealing with the things in your life that will always just be the case, your family, what your strengths and weaknesses are. Coming to terms with those things often requires that you accept some things and that you change other things.
Right.
And the first step in that change, I think, for a lot of people is acknowledging that it is possible to become more knowledgeable, acknowledging that it is possible to become more skilled, more healthy, and that it's not just the people that you see who are excelling at things like music or athletics or things like that that are capable of these things. It is everyone who is capable of becoming, somewhat greater than they are, not feeling that you're doomed to become your parents, or you're doomed to become, whoever it is you end up with. I think that that's an important message for people to have.
Yeah. Okay. All that so incredible. Just to add a little bit, I would just say, yeah, you are not your thoughts. Like that's what I think you're getting at. My second guest I had on here was this brilliant philosopher and journalist friend of mine who's in Bali right now and in India, and he's the nicest dude I know, the wisest person I know, and I think I had him on my second episode, so it was kind of long like this one. Maybe that's just talking to philosophers, but he had he was really big on that. When I asked him what are you grateful for, he said that I'm not my thoughts. That I can just kind of separate myself from that. I mean, it's a very like advanced mindfulness realization.
That thing comes only. You can't really understand the significance of that statement until you've done some like Cartesian type doubt, which is like you have to be able to be an observer of your own thoughts. That's different than just being an observer. You observe that you are a thinking thing. You are a thing that thinks. That's what I think meditation is for. It's for you to realize a certain selflessness to the thoughts themselves while realizing that the self resides in the thinking.
It's really profound. And I think sometimes when people hear that, like maybe they do like a heuristic, they do a shortcut, and they get kind of confused, or they don't want to deeply think about it. So
it's work.
But to put it in more concrete terms, this is something I discovered, I think, 3 years ago. It put me on my path to do in the future a PhD in neuroeconomics and really study neuroscience in the brain. So there's this science writer called Stephen Kotler, and he has a video, and I'll post a link to it under this, but it's my favorite video of all time on YouTube, and I watch a lot of videos. And it's called Slow Your Brain Down to Get More Done. And what he does is he explains the neuroscience behind flow, and when you meditate and when you separate yourself. And he said that neuroscientists studied mountain climbers, they studied professional surfers, they studied jazz musicians. When they improvised, they studied Tibetan monks, and they found all of them had something in common when they're in this flow state, and their self dissolves. So when a mountain climber says he feels one with the mountain, when a surfer says he feels one with the wave, when a musician says he feels one with the music, when a Tibetan monk says he feels one with the universe itself, the part of your brain, a part of the prefrontal cortex where your morality comes from, where your sense of self comes from, where your thinking, that voice in your head comes from, it's what makes us human. It temporarily shuts down. They have a scientific term for this called temporal hypofrontality, which means the front part of your brain for a temporary period of time is slowed down.
Send me a link to this.
I will. No, and I will to this podcast so our listeners can listen to it. But it's really interesting, and I have looked into the research. Like, it is valid. They need to do more, and I want to study it. But
I know all that stuff's true. I just didn't know
yes,
that
but
it was
now
true.
we're getting to actual scientific evidence. This is why neuroscience is so exciting. They're finding so many interesting things. So it's like, of course, the Tibetan monk says he feels one through the universe because it's impossible for his brain to differentiate. And I think that's where you can get peace, and that's where you can get compassion, you can get love from, is by having this part of our brain, which we evolved, which no other species of animal has. That's what makes us unique. By just shutting that down temporarily, you can get so much done, and you can be so connected effortlessly, right? You're not even have to think. You're not thinking.
Well, can I give you my perspective on that?
Please do.
Well, and I know you only got a little bit of time here.
No, take your time.
So here's the thing with oneness with
Yes.
the universe, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. We should not acknowledge necessarily the same type of oneness of the human mind or soul to the universe as we would acknowledge that one page is part of a book. That's not the kind of oneness that I mean when I talk about.
What do you mean?
What I mean is that since we have the experience of the universe, we are distinct from the universe. For example, like, we couldn't be seeing the universe as in front of us and being a phenomena if we were the same thing as it. We are not literally the same thing as the universe. I think the universe and humans are kindred. It's like saying I'm with my friend. It's like saying that I'm with someone that shares a lot of my interests. It is that we are the same, and that so we consider this to be a type of oneness.
Yeah.
I think the oneness with the universe that kind of exists as feeling some kind of non-discrimination between yourself and the forces of the universe is a little bit too funky for me, and maybe I need to delve a little bit more into it.
Yeah,
but that
fine.
Experience that you talked about in the prefrontal cortex is completely vibes with what I just said.
Oh, of course.
Could be either explanation.
And anyone can experience flow. I would argue anyone has experienced flow. When you are with your partner for the first time and you click and you're at a cafe or at a park, I think actually Einstein had a good quote on this. What is relativity? Relativity is how if you put your finger on a stove, what is it, right? I'm struggling.
For 1 minute, you're gonna have a horrible.
A minute passes like an hour. But if you're sitting next to a beautiful girl that you love, who you met for the first time at a park, an hour passes in a minute. So, relativity. Another cool aspect of temporal hypofrontality is that time is fuzzy. It's like, and it's so true. So if you've ever had the opposite of writer's block, so you're just writing and you're just in a flow state, or you are playing an instrument, you forget about time, you forget about space, like, and this isn't just this woo spiritual thing. No, now we're getting hard science. It's like, no, your brain is so different during these states, and we can pinpoint it. The other weird thing to add to it is that it's the same thing that happens to people who have certain mental illnesses. So in schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, which I have, you have something more severe than transient hypofrontality. You have something called hypofrontality, and this is quite extensive in the psychological scientific literature, and it's a problem to actually be in this state of mind for too long. So, for instance, for me with mania, like, it's an amazing feeling, at least hypomania, a more mild version of it. But in pure mania, I always say the problem is that there's no off switch, right? I never want to go to bed. I stayed awake for 65 hours straight once because I was always in flow, always feeling good. This is a problem, right? But I was pushing my brain, but my brain was saying, look, you don't need to give me stimulants. You don't need to give me coffee. I don't need 5-hour energy. I'm awake. Like, imagine feeling awake at your best for 65 hours. Yeah. So anyways, there are problems to this. I think there's a dark side to everything, but my bottom line is to the listeners is, I would say, cultivate more flow into your life. So you can do this by walking in nature, meditating, music, talking to people one-on-one like we've been doing. All these can instigate flow. I'm sure you experience a lot of flow when you're in the woods. I mean, nature only adds to it. I really want to study this in more depth, but I thought, I gotta mention this,
Yeah, totally, man.
Yeah. So, anyways, I think we'll end it there. To anyone listening, if you've listened all the way this much, I hope that was rewarding to hear. And I highly recommend going into the woods like Zeke does, and I highly recommend checking out his album on Spotify. What's the title of the album again?
Animals of God and War.
Yes, that's a hard name to forget. Really covers a lot, and it's really good if you like piano, if you like guitar, if you like music. I mean, there's a lot in there. I really enjoyed it. So, anyway, Zeke, thank you for coming at the roundtable.
Yeah. See you later, Thomas.
Great. Thanks so much for listening to this special episode of the Roundtable Chats podcast. I hope you got as much out of it as I did. I really did not know what to expect. Zeke and I had never spoken in person before this interview, so it was quite extraordinary how much chemistry we had. I just wanted to apologize for how fast and how much I talked this interview. Usually I listen more. I think I had a cup of coffee before the episode, so that might be why. Anyways, life's a work in progress. But I mean, just listening to this, it's like he's really gifted at music, and it inspires me, honestly. So, anyways, if you're listening to me right now, go outside, go into nature, practice waking up early, be compassionate, call your parents, call your loved ones. Life is short. And if there's any project you want to do, just do it. Just start. Life is short. And anyways, that's it. See you next time.